The dragon sickness in The Hobbit is basically being possessed by your possessions. So Smaug, the dragon, he's squatting on a huge mound of treasure under the Lonely Mountain that's of no use to him whatsoever. The key thing is, at the beginning of The Hobbit, we have Bilbo Baggins possessed by his possessions. That's why Gandalf says to Bilbo, no, you should go on this adventure because it will be good for you. He says, if you survive. It's quite clear that the faith was the most important thing in Tolkien's life. It made sense of everything else, that everything else was informed by it. I mean, he said of The Lord of the Rings, I'm quoting him word for word here, The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work.
Bingo.
Unconsciously at first, consciously in the revision. That's what he said.
Q had us, before the show, cue up a letter he wrote to his son about the Eucharist. One of the most powerful things probably ever written from a father to a son.
Out of the darkness of my life, so much frustrated, I put before you the one great thing to love on earth, the Blessed Sacrament. There you will find romance, glory, honor, fidelity, and the true way of all your loves upon earth. Are we going to lay down our lives for others? Are we going to take up our cross? In other words, are we going to embrace suffering? Or are we going to refuse?
Man, we've done a lot together. Here's some evidence of it, so I'm honored that you're here once again.
Well, it's a joy to be with you, Conor.
Yeah, thanks. And I say once again, it's the first time you've been on my podcast because it's not that new. But I did want to just kind of have a visual, picture paints 1,000 words, how many projects we've done together. Everything from Merry England, Bilbo's journey, Frodo's journey, further up and further in, C.S. Lewis and the Catholic Church, and then actually these that sell really well because they're wonderful gift items. Poems every Catholic should know, poems every child should know. And then you wrote a book for us on Benedict XVI, which is kind of cool because we had you write that long before he died because we all thought he was going to die, and then he hung on forever. It's like, when can we publish this book? And then Candles in the Dark. We went to together. We went to Jamaica to meet Father Ho Long and the Missionaries of the Poor, and that was kind of remarkable. So you wrote his story, and I was really honored to publish Race with the Devil, your biography, book on Belloc, Old Thunder, and then many Catholic courses, everything from talking about Lord of the Rings and Bilbo's journey, and then we also did Shakespeare's Catholicism. So with all of that said, I mean, we just have a long history. We've been friends for many, many years. And, I wanted to tell everybody how I first met you. And I was in grad school at Catholic U, and I'm reading all of your books, and I'm like a Joseph Pearce expert. And I think it's like my distraction from philosophy and law. And I had read all of your Chesterton book and your Belloc book and more. And I emailed you and I asked you, like, hey, my name's Conor Gallagher. And have you ever trekked the path to Rome? And then you talked to me, no, but I've walked some here and there. And I'm like, I can't believe he responded to me. And then one day I met you outside of Mass somewhere, and who knew I'd end up running tan, and we contact you, and now look, we've done all of this. So it's a pleasure to have you here. You're a dear friend. You're a champion for the church, for tradition, for literature, for beauty, for truth, for goodness. Joseph Pearce is just a champion of the Catholic faith. So I love you, buddy, and I'm glad you're here.
Thank you. It's a joy to be here. It's a joy to call you friend. I do have to tell you, my wife's version of the first time we met in person. It was in Steubenville, and it was at Mass.
Yeah.
And we just got married. I think it was the day after we got married or something. And I think you came up and said, are you Joseph Pearce, the author? And she said, no, he's Joseph Pearce, the husband.
That's right. Yes. And that said it right. She set the tone for the rest of your life, That's awesome. Yeah. So I should people say, oh yeah, Conor, you work at TAN? I'm like, no, I work for my wife Ashley.
Exactly.
It's like I am Ashley's husband.
Yeah. Pater familias first, right?
That's right. That's right. So yeah. Well, anyway, I'm going to put these down. They don't need to be sitting up here the whole time, but it's just a wonderful representation of all the stuff we've done together, and hopefully more to come.
Yeah, the last time I was in the studio, actually, Conor, was to do the authority.
Oh, I forgot that. I forgot it because I didn't have a physical copy here.
Yeah, but that was great. And it's wonderful. I've heard so many positive things when I'm on the lecture circuit traveling. People saying they really enjoy that. So that was an absolute joy to do with you folks.
Yeah, it's awesome. I feel like an idiot not mentioning it, but if I don't have the physical copy, I forgot. But authority with author popped out, right? It's kind of catchy. Kevin came up with that one. And you go through 30 different Catholic authors or Catholic-minded authors, and you kind of just give a little bit of overview of their life and times and works, right?
Exactly. And my approach is what I call authorialism, hence the title was perfect for that we should try to read works through the author's lens, through the eyes of the author as far as possible, because the author has more authority than the reader over the meaning of a text. So we should have the humility as readers to try to understand it through the perspective of the author. So that was the approach of the whole series. Yeah, we went through, I think, from Homer, pre-Christian right through the 20th century. So, yeah. Yeah,
it's awesome. And now on Tan Digital, not that I'm trying to plug our new app, but it's even easier to listen to. All of this great audio and video stuff you've made for us. It's always been a little clunky for people to watch because they got to go to Audible or, something, or download it off the website. But now Tan Digital app, it's just so easy to download that from Apple Store or wherever you get an app, and then it's just all right. And we need to get that on your phone. I know you're not the first person to adopt technology. Fair enough.
I always tell people that I'm not chained to my phone. I think I've got about 2 apps on my phone. So I'm going to be a hard selfie.
We're going to put Tan Digital on there. I'll give you a free subscription, but then you can listen to all of your own stuff. While driving around the car. Anyway. So yeah, when we said, hey, we got to have Joseph, he lives just, kind of down the street, about an hour and a half away or something like that. And it's nice to catch up and talk about the family and everything. We could talk about 1,000 different things, but we are going to focus on the life and times and person of J.R.R. Tolkien, because everyone knows sort of the Lord of the Rings. But we don't necessarily go deep enough into his life, the kind of the man that wrote the Lord of the Rings. So I kind of wanted to focus on that. Although with you, it's hard to pick because you could talk about anybody, but we're going to choose him, and maybe we'll do other people later. But first, I want to put up his website, Joseph's website here. And I just want to encourage the listeners who, I know my customers love Joseph Pearce, and they might not know that this is a great place, and you just so happen to have our book on the homepage. We didn't plan that, but it's a great place where you can get access to your blog, but you also have a paid subscription where people get extra content. So I'd love for you to tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, so the best one-stop place for me is jpearce.co, jpearce.co.
That's what this is, jpearce.co.
Exactly. And then the Inner Sanctum is the subscription section. And every week I record 4 podcasts, 2 video podcasts and 2 audio podcasts. So there's hundreds of podcasts now in the archives, but 4 fresh ones every single week. So there you can see, get scrolled up there. That's what I posted this week on there. So check me out, jpearce.co, and support me, my family, and my work by becoming a member of the Inner Sanctum.
Yeah, you guys should do that because Joseph travels hard, and it's traveling. It's one thing. Like sometimes I travel. I shouldn't say this on the air. Maybe you should edit this out, see how it comes out. But like sometimes a guy with a bunch of kids likes to travel to get the hell out of the house sometimes. But you getting out of the house is a little harder than me getting out of the house. So do you mind telling people a little bit about that? Because a lot of people that read your books don't necessarily know the challenge that you have at home.
Yeah, well, I mean, so you have, I think, 17 children at last count. It's difficult to keep count with you.
Yeah.
I think last time we met, you had 15.
Yeah,
so
they keep coming. Yeah.
I turned my back, and you had another couple. We've had 7. We had 4 miscarriages and a daughter who was stillborn. So it's been a bit of a tough time. But our son Leo, who's the elder, we have a 17-year-old daughter. He's 23 years old. And he has Down syndrome and autism. So the challenge when I travel is that means that my wife has him 24/7. When both of us are at home, we switch out. I get up with him in the morning. I put him to bed at night. If he wakes up in the night, I have him. Susanna has him all day long when I'm working. So it's a teamwork, right? Yeah. But when I'm away, then she has him 24/7. So
that's hard.
Yeah, but she's very, very good. She never complains. I married a saint, and she's doing her best to make me one.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah. Well, Leah's been to our house years ago, and I can always remember kind of how old he is because my oldest is 23. You know, but to tie this off, it's like I think it was Father Ho Long who actually wrote. I think this is in the book you wrote on him, but he did say somewhere that Down syndrome is God's answer to parents' prayer that the little one would never grow up.
Yeah.
Something kind of beautiful like that.
And that's certainly the case. He's the happiest member of our family. He has have a permanent child. He's 23 years in terms of how long he's been with us, but he's plays on the swing set. He play ball with him. We got his little circuit in our house. He rides around on his scooter. So yeah, it's like having a permanent little kid.
Yeah. Okay. Well, awesome. The idea that you could get Joseph Pearce content, every single week is kind of amazing because, you don't just like teach literature. No, you have helped teach me and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of other people probably by now, how to think, like how to view the world. People talk about like a Catholic worldview, and it's sort of like, what does that mean? It doesn't mean you go read Plato and Aristotle necessarily. It's like viewing culture, society, family, education, religion, devotion through the eyes of truth, beauty, and goodness. And that's what you're able to do more than any theologian out there talking about, some high level thing. You're teaching humans how to think like real humans. So that's kind of the gem that Joseph Pearce brings to things, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Let's talk about J.R.R. Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien. What's the second R?
So John Ronald Reuel. I have no idea where Reuel comes from, but that's it. That's the second R.
Yeah. So I guess let's just start by once upon a time he was born, and something amazing happened after that because he ended up being one of the greatest minds really on the planet, probably in certain ways. But what can you tell us about like his earliest life?
Yeah, well, Tolkien himself said, I'm going to begin by disagreeing with Tolkien. That's always a good way to start, but in a very friendly, whimsical way. So Tolkien said that I was born in the Shire in a pre-mechanical age. And he was born, he wasn't, by the Shire, he meant England, but he was actually born in Bloemfontein, South Africa. Because his father was working for a bank and they happened to be living out there. I mean, both his parents were English. And when he was just 2 years old, they moved back to his mother and his younger brother, Hilary, moved back to England. The father was going to move back once he tied it up with the business stuff, but he actually got sick and died in South Africa. So we have, first of all, with Tolkien, someone who barely remembers his father. So barely remembers his father.
Roughly what time period are we talking about?
Well, he was born in 1892.
1892.
In Bloemfontein, South Africa. 1892. And his father died, I think, when he was, I can't remember if he was 2 or 3 years old when his father actually died. So, in the mid-1890s. But they'd already moved back to England. And the tragedy or the challenge was that that obviously now his mother's a widow. And in 1900, so when Tolkien's eight, his mother becomes a Catholic, is received into the church. And both her own family and her deceased husband's family were very hostile to Catholicism and very antagonistic to her decision, and they cut her off financially. So she was already really living in poverty with the 2 children as a single mother, relying on the charity of family. But then when they basically cut off her financial resources, they were literally thrown into penury. And Tolkien remembers living in slums in Birmingham, in England, and considered his mother to be a martyr for the faith because of the sacrifices she made to ensure, as he put it, that he and Hilary were brought up as Catholics.
Dang. So he lived in the slums. How would a kid like that in that time period have gotten like a good education? Because clearly he got one at some point.
Yeah, so I think his mother did the best that he possibly could until she herself died in 1906 when he was 14. Thereafter, Father Francis Morgan at the Birmingham Oratory became his guardian. But so he had a good education, and both his mother and Father Morgan were very conscientious in ensuring that his education was good and solid. So he, having graduated from high school and finished high school, he was accepted into Oxford University. But this was at the time of World War I, so that was also going to disrupt things considerably.
Well, who's this Father Francis Morgan? What else can you tell us about him?
Well, first of all, he was a member of the Oratorians, so they were basically brought over to England by St. John Henry Newman. St. John Henry Newman was very influenced by St. Philip Neri, the founder of the Oratorians, and St. John Henry Newman founded the Birmingham Oratory. And Father Morgan was a member of the Birmingham Oratory and actually knew the aging Cardinal Newman. So if you like, the
soon to be a doctor.
Soon doctor of the church now, of course. Well, yes, soon to be named the doctor of the church now. But if in some sense, as Tolkien, Newman died in 1890, Tolkien was born in 1892. He was from 1900 onwards was knowing Father Francis Morgan, who'd become a friend of his mother. So in some sense, we can say that the ghost of St. John Henry Newman sort of haunted Tolkien's childhood, because obviously that giant figure, only recently deceased at this point, would have sort of been walking in terms of influence the corridors of the oratory, where Tolkien and his brother Hilary would cycle. After their mother's death, they were staying with an aunt, and there wasn't a very close relationship. So Tolkien and his brother would cycle every morning to the Birmingham Oratory and serve Father Morgan's Mass. So they very much are part of this sort of inheritance that Newman had brought to England.
Yeah, I would think that's given that. I guess did Tolkien's mother convert before he was born or after?
No, but she converted him in 1900, so Tolkien would have been,
so he would have been 8, right?
8.
That's right. She converted when he was 8, so I guess that kind of makes him a convert too.
Yeah, what I say actually in my biography of Tolkien, I called him, I think the opening chapter, or maybe chapter 2, cradle convert.
Cradle convert,
because he's neither. What is he? He's not technically a cradle Catholic because he's 8 before he's baptized and received into the church. Right. But then didn't make his own decision
I love
either.
That. Cradle convert.
Yeah,
that's good.
Cradle convert.
But, given that the hostility that he would have experienced probably personally at that time in England, and then certainly he saw his mother suffer, John Henry Newman would have been even more influential because being a convert, I think Newman took a lot of flack for converting, so.
Yes, and certainly that Tolkien understood that, and Tolkien, as I said, considered his own mother to be a martyr. I'm sure he would have considered John Henry Newman to be a martyr. There were white martyrs, those that aren't physically killed, but nonetheless have to sacrifice their lives in mortification for becoming Catholics.
Now, did he meet his wife before Oxford or while he was at Oxford?
No, he met his future wife. That's an interesting story. Edith Bratt, her name was, and she was a bit older than him. They're both orphans, so both lost both parents. So they formed a bond and they fell in love. But Father Morgan was not happy with this. And he was not happy with this because he wanted John Henry Newman at that age, J.R.R. Tolkien at that age to concentrate on his studies, to not get sidetracked and distracted from his studies. So he extracted from Tolkien a promise that he would cease seeing this lady that he loved, until he was 21. And it says a great deal for Tolkien and his obedience and his virtue that he was good to that promise. But what's very interesting, he writes to Edith on his 21st birthday. So clearly, he hasn't.
He'd been waiting. He was counting down the days.
Oh yeah. He's going to be obedient, but as soon as the vow was no longer necessary. So he wrote on his 21st birthday, but discovered Edith was engaged to be married to someone else. Man. So he jumps on a train and actually goes to where she is and persuades her that she's making a huge mistake and that she is meant to marry him. And obviously, he is very persuasive, and they subsequently get married. And when Tolkien goes off to fight in World War I, they're expecting their first child, John. And they would have 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter.
So he looked at her and said, listen, I'm going to write a book about elves and hobbits, make a fortune. So I'm the guy to marry.
Yeah, he's a prophet.
I mean, I'm writing an elvish language, honey.
Exactly.
Come on.
Yeah, everybody's doing it.
Right. Who can resist that?
In actual fact, that when he saw her, I think it was just after they were married, they were out in the woods somewhere, and she was in a youthful way, was dancing, in the woods, newlyweds. You can just imagine the scene, right? And he was inspired by this to write what possibly his greatest love story, the story of Beren and Luthien, so between a mortal man and an elvish woman. And so for Tolkien, Edith was always his Luthien. And when she died, he had on her grave, Edith, wife of J.R.R. Tolkien, Luthien.
Oh, wow.
And then when he died, his children had his name added in Beren. So that's the incarnation of this love story that was inspired by her shortly after they got married.
So Beren and Luthien.
Yeah.
And so that's not part of the Lord of the Rings, but it's part of Middle Earth? Is that what you would
so
say?
the main story about it's told in the Silmarillion and in other places, but it's mentioned in the Lord of the Rings. It's mentioned in the Lord of the Rings.
So because I barely know the Lord of the Rings story. And by the way, I should say, I told you this before, and you had a very savvy response, but I might be the only traditional Catholic in the history of the world to not have read the Lord of the Rings. I've read The Hobbit twice, and I've read Fellowship of the Ring twice, and I get the Two Towers, and I always give up. Yeah. So, but you assured me that it's not a mortal sin.
Yeah, what I said, the good news is it's not a mortal sin. The bad news is you're not getting into heaven, so you're reading it. Because if you don't do it before you die, I'm sure it's part of everybody's purgatory, right?
If that's purgatory, that ain't so bad.
It could be worse, right?
You got to finish it.
It could be worse.
So, but I really don't know much about his corpus, of work and everything. And so, tell me a little bit more about that story. Is it a standalone work? It's just in the Silmarillion, or like, what is that mythological story there?
Yeah. So with Tolkien's work, actually, one thing I find beautiful about Tolkien's work is, we know from the opening line of St. John's Gospel, in the beginning was the Word. But in Tolkien's case, it's also true, because what happened, he began with inventing an Elvish language. So no stories, just a language. But of course, once you have a language, you want people to speak the language, to make it real, to enflesh it, to make it incarnate, right? So he then starts writing stories about elves so they can be speaking his language he's invented. So he begins with the word, and then the word becomes flesh in these stories. And Tolkien writes lots of stories, many of them are unfinished. Long before he starts The Hobbit, which is in the 1930s, he begins writing The Hobbit for his own children. But prior to that, he's got all these various different stories, and a lot of them are brought together. Some of the best of them are brought together by Tolkien's son Christopher shortly after Tolkien died, and were published in 1977. So 4 years after Tolkien's death, as the Silmarillion, and the main story of Beren and Luthien is included in that.
So he didn't write a book called the Silmarillion. It's a collection of his different stuff.
Exactly. When he was planning, hoping to finish something which would be akin to the Silmarillion, but he was such a perfectionist that he finished relatively few things. There were lots of unfinished things. So his son Christopher brought the pieces that were most complete together in the Silmarillion afterwards, and I'm comfortable with that. Some of the other work that Christopher Tolkien does, a 12-volume history of Middle-earth, some of this is sort of scraps of paper that he's sort of weaving together. How much of that Tolkien would be happy that has been published is a matter of conjecture, but the Silmarillion, I think he would be pleased with, and it gives the creation story of Middle-earth, which is profoundly Catholic.
Yeah, no, that's one of the few things I have read, because only part of it, but enough to see like there was this one god or one angel, I'm not sure, I think it was one god who was singing a beautiful note, and then he created essentially angels, I guess, and they started singing with him a harmony, but then somebody decided to sing their own note. Did I get that roughly right? This is years ago.
That's basically, and now that just you got it right. So the Silmarillion begins, in the beginning was the One, capital O, Iluvata, the All-Father.
Yes.
So yes, one God. In the beginning was the one, Iluvata. And then the first beings of his creation are angels. So there's no physical cosmos. There's just angelic beings. But what he then does is he presents to the angels the great music, capital G, capital M, which is very much part of Christian tradition. So if we can go for a slight tangent here, that we all know Boethius as someone who wrote the Constellation of Philosophy, but he also wrote a book called De Musica, or music, and it was the major musical textbook of the Middle Ages. I mean, very influential for 1,000 years. And what that talks about is there being three different types of music: the musica universalis, the universal music, the music of the spheres, the music of the cosmos. In other words, that the cosmos itself is a work of music. So God has brought this music into being. And we should understand here, because music in the broader sense of the word, as in the muses. So this work of beautiful art, beautiful creation. So in that sense, you can say work of literature is music, or a great painting is music, or cathedral is music. But basically, God brings this beautiful music into being. And then there's the musica humana, which is human music. In other words, that we are a piece of music created by God, separate from the rest of the cosmos, because we the Imago Dei, we made the image of God, which means that amongst other things, I mean, we can love, we can reason, but we can create. Like God's a creator, we are creators, and Tolkien used the word sub-creator to distinguish, because God creates ex nihilo, from nothing. We create from other things that already exist. So we are sub-creators. But they're not. That means we're also called to make great music. We are called to tell stories, to build cathedrals, to paint pictures, to compose music, because that's part of the Imago Dei, the imagination, the image of God in us. So this understanding of music informs Tolkien's creation story. Tolkien's a medievalist. Obviously, he knows Boethius. So we have Middle Earth is brought into being as a musical composition with God as the composer. But the very profound theology is God doesn't say to the angels, behold the great music, hearken, behold the great music, listen. He says, behold the great music, play. In other words, that we are meant to actually participate in the music, but of course we're meant to play according to the score, right? To keep with the harmony of the cosmos, with God's providence, with God's design. But Melkor, the mightiest of the angels, through his pride, wanted to bring his own discordant tone into the music. And that creates this war in the symphony and the great music. And then there's a war in heaven, and Melkor falls into the void. The language that Tolkien uses is very similar to the fall of Lucifer in the book of Isaiah. And then he becomes fallen into hell. And then Sauron, the Dark Lord and Lord of the Rings, is the greatest of Melkor's servants. So Sauron is a demon, and the most powerful demon except for Satan himself, and he's the Dark Lord in the Lord of the Rings. And if I can just carry on from one other while I'm on this thought.
Dude, you can go for the next 2 hours. This is amazing. Keep going. Go. Hey guys, real quick, we noticed 80% of you that watch the episodes are not subscribed. So please do me the favor and subscribe and hit the bell for notification. That helps you get the content, but it also helps this amazing stuff get spread to other people just like you. Thanks for your help. Now let's dive back in.
Well, because Narnia, right? The Chronicles of Narnia, Aslan sings Narnia into being. So that Narnia is Aslan's song. So you can see that Tolkien and Lewis, first of all, they cross-fertilize, they influence each other. So I would think that the creation of Narnia is influenced by the creation of Middle Earth, which Tolkien would have read to Lewis before he writes the Narnia stories. But both of them are influenced by Boethius. They're part of this living Catholic tradition of creativity.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's incredible. I mean, it's interesting. I don't know if this is actually connected or not, but we talk about the choir of angels, these different levels of creation, but we call them choirs. I mean, I don't know if that has something to do way back in Catholic theology of music. I don't know, and maybe not, but I do. It is easy to understand the universe as a harmonious expression of God.
Yeah, harmony is the key word here. I mean,
Yeah.
beauty is something which is harmonious. So it's not just oral, not just something we hear, it's something we can see, something we can experience, something we can taste. I mean, so as Thomas Aquinas said, beauty basically is about the order, the harmony of a thing. It's perfection.
You call it form, right?
Form, exactly.
Yeah, and so when you see something that's disformed, there's something off in the harmony of it.
Yeah, exactly. It becomes ugly.
Yeah, that's amazing. All right. I mean, that's amazing. So let's go back, though, to where he enters Oxford. So he's probably very well educated by Father Francis Morgan. He's told, hey, chill out on the girl until you're 21. But I suspect he enters Oxford at like 18 or something. I don't know. I mean, is it roughly the same as we do? You go to college about 18? Yep. But then you said the war enters. World War I started in what, like
1914? So Tolkien would have been, when the war started, he would have been, I'll get this right now, he would have been 20.
1892.
He'd have been 22.
Okay.
So 21, because he's born late in the year, 21 when the war started.
So he was at Oxford for a while before the war got started. So do we know much about like his first few years at Oxford before he went off to the war?
Yeah, so he didn't go off to the war until 1916. So he continued his studies at Oxford before going and got married, and they were expecting,
that's right.
They were expecting their first child. And then he went off in 1916 to what he called the animal horror of the Battle of the Somme. And it really is, I think, probably impossible for us to imagine the horror of what was experienced by people. I don't know about figures, but I'm not a military historian. But if the Battle of Somme is not the bloodiest battle in human history, it's one of them. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people killed within a few days. And literally, you smell. They couldn't get corpses of men, corpses of horses rotting where they were with flies and the stench of death, and just because it was impossible to get that many people cleared up, quite frankly. So the living were living amongst the mangled stench of the decaying dead.
Trench warfare. I mean, it was just so brutal. And I'm a military historian, but it was like, logistically, it was old school war, where they're just kind of like fighting for inch by inch by inch by inch, kind of like the Revolutionary War, where people would line up and shoot and fall and line up again and shoot. They were doing that, but with like machine guns and missiles and, modern artillery with old school strategy. And that equaled complete brutality, so.
Well, Tolkien called World War II the first great war of the machines, but it wasn't. World War I was the first great war of the machines. You mentioned machine guns, but in no man's land, other new inventions we don't think about were invented for World War I. Barbed wire, so you're trying to advance through no man's land with machine guns and shells that are much more powerful than ever tanks. Poison gas, mustard gas, and you're getting yourself caught up in barbed wire and you can't make any progress at all. I mean, the whole thing, and say just to line people up and send them over the top towards a hail of machine gun fire was madness. And and even having horses in the bogged down in the trenches in mud, like completely impractical. So you had these people that sort of thought they were fighting the Napoleonic War of 100 years earlier with all this modern technology, and it was a disaster.
But going back, I'm sure that influenced his picture of Mordor and stuff like that, which we'll get to. But when he first goes to Oxford, do you know what he was studying? Like, did you pick like a major like we do? Or, I mean, you just study? I mean, what did he think he was going to do when he went to Oxford? And what were those first few years like?
Yeah, well, basically he studied classics, so that would mean languages. So in Oxford there was a big distinction between the languages department and the literature department. They're not the same thing. And in fact, C.S. Lewis said that ever since my mother's near time, ever since I was a child, I was taught never to trust a papist. And ever since I arrived in Oxford, never to trust a philologist. And he said, and Tolkien was both. a papist philologist, a Catholic philologist. So basically, philology, which is Tolkien's speciality, just means the love of the word, love of languages. So he studied languages in general. So he knew his Greek, he knew his Latin, but his particular fascination with the languages of Northern Europe. So he studied Old Norse, so the language of the Vikings and of the Icelandic sagas, which he loved, and that's what brought Tolkien and Lewis together, their shared love of the Norse sagas. But also Anglo-Saxon, Old English, the language from before the Norman conquest.
Yeah, so if we heard Old English read to us, like we wouldn't recognize it at all, would we?
No, it would sound sort of probably a cross between Dutch and German, quite frankly. I mean, it's if you haven't, so you can read Chaucer's English, which is Middle English, and with a little bit of effort, and that's 14th century. If a little bit of effort, you can and a crib for the odd word that and you can make your way through it. It's not that difficult, but that's because by his time, they called him the father of modern poetry, Chaucer, because you got this blending following the Norman conquest of the Germanic English and the French, which is of course the Latin language, and these two come together. So in English, you can say it's a rich language because we have both. So for instance, the word freedom, the German Freiheit, the word freedom is Germanic, but the word liberty, right, is French, Latin. So we have this melding of the two. But when you go before the Norman conquest, before the French came over, it's all just purely Germanic language and really indecipherable. And you have to learn it as a foreign language, basically.
Yeah. So he's studying languages. Why would you study philology?
Yeah.
Is it because he was just planning on being a professor of logic, or of language? Yeah,
I think he did it in the old-fashioned sense of the word as an amateur, not as someone who's not very good at something. An amateur comes from the word amor, to love. Right? He did it basically, and what's the word philology? Philos, to love. Right? So he did it because he loved the word. He loved the language. He loved what you could do with the music of language. He also was fascinated by the laws of language, right? How does language work? Because once you understand that, it's very easy to learn other languages, right? Because they all follow.
Yeah, I've noticed people that learn a couple, and then they can learn a whole bunch.
Exactly, because most languages are abiding by the same rules. So he was fascinated. But then yes, the amateur in the good sense of the word, somebody who does it purely for love, did become a profession. He did become a professor of philology at Oxford University. So he became an academic, and that was what he imagined. He certainly did not imagine in the 1920s when he got back from World War I that he was going to be a famous author. No, he was going to be a scholar at Oxford.
So he's studying this. It's interrupted by the war. So he maybe didn't have junior and senior year like we do in college, but somewhere along the line, it's interrupted. He's married, right? They're having their first kid, and then he's probably drafted. Do you know? Does he sign up does he sign up willingly, or
yes.
How's that work? Yeah.
Yeah. He they did bring conscription in, but no, he volunteered. He held off to essentially finish his studies, but then as soon as he immediately signed up. Following a hurried marriage, and honeymoon, etc.
Right.
But yes, and he went off and again arriving just in time for the animal horror of the Battle of the Somme, and could very easily not have survived. And in case many, indeed most of his friends that he knew in the army did not survive. This is true of both Tolkien and Lewis, that they carry the burden of close friends who were killed in the war.
So I guess the horror of that war, it probably doesn't take a great imagination to figure out how that influenced his understanding of evil and helped his imagination later on, depicting Mordor and, all of that. So comment on that. I mean, how do you think that influenced his image of evil, which he so wonderfully articulated?
Yeah, I think that a few things. First of all, the darkness. He understood that evil was pervasive. Not all pervasive. I mean, one of the key scenes in Lord of the Rings is when things are at their worst, or so it seems, that Samwise Gamgee looks up and he's on the edge of Mordor, and it's all murky and ugly. But just beyond all the murk, when he looks up, there's just a hint of light. and he says, above all shadows rides the sun. So this, again, another old word for who we are from Greek, anthropos. And this is, according to Plato, etymologically, anthropos means he who looks up. Now, the animal grazes, constrained by instinct, head down, looking, following his appetite. A man gazes. We have instincts, we have appetites, but we can transcend and supersede those with things that are higher. So Tolkien understood humanity as anthropos, but he also understood the reality of evil, and a lot of that was a result of World War I and the horrors he saw, but also his mistrust, dislike of machines, particularly. So in the beginning of The Hobbit, towards the beginning of The Hobbit, the narrator says that the goblins, he says, it's not unlikely that goblins are responsible for many of the machines that afflict our world, especially ingenious devices for killing large numbers of people at once.
Oh, wow.
So, for him, that the weapons of mass destruction are the products of orcs. Yeah. So that's obviously witnessing machines being used to crush people during World War I. And then in Lord of the Rings, scenes such as the Dead Marshes, where you look down at this sort of swamp with all this mud and puddles, and you look down at the bottom and there's corpses looking up at you, and again, you could just imagine that's a graphic depiction of what was the reality in the trenches.
It's incredible. So he comes back from war, and then does he just apply for a professorship and gets it? Do you have to go to some crappy college first and work your way up to Oxford? Does he come back and he's like, hey, I graduated last year, I just fought in the war, and he gets a professorship at Oxford? That's kind of like a big jump.
Yeah, well, no, I'm going to, as you probably have, many viewers in England, and some from Yorkshire in the north of England. I'm going to not say that Leeds University, the University of Leeds, is a crappy college.
Okay, I'm not saying you did. I have no idea what college is. I'm not.
But obviously, no, it's not on the same level as Oxford. So you are correct that his first academic position was at the University of Leeds in Yorkshire, in the medieval department, and he was there, I think, for about 2 years before he was offered the position at Oxford. Okay. And so, by I think 1926 or something, he began at Oxford, mid-20s anyway.
So he did have to start he had to work his way up to Oxford. You don't just go from student to professor.
No.
When in this whole thing did he start writing Elvish? Was he 12, or was he at the battlefield? Do you know if he was actually creating any of this language or mythology during his studies, during the war? When did this start? Yeah,
so I think the date that's normally given for when he invents his first Elvish language is 1916. So it's actually the same year as the Battle of the Somme. Okay, so it dates back to World War I. And under some of the early stories, they have these, the demonic powers with having these metal machines that are being used against the good guys. So certainly quite clearly influenced by the experience of World War I. But no, he begins, I say, the Elvish language comes first, the stories follow.
So, but I mean, he really created a language that would work. People could learn it and speak it.
Oh yeah, absolutely, because it obeys all the rules. I mean, he's a philologist. He knows how languages work, and he creates one because he knows how to make it work.
It's amazing. It's amazing. All right, so he's a couple years. He gets to Oxford, and then he's teaching. Now, what do you know about the teaching there? What was his daily life like as a professor, or they call them dons or tutors, or what? Was he going? He wasn't going into a class of 30 students 5 times a day and teaching. I don't think it really worked like that, did it? Or
no, there were lectures, and the lectures would have a larger number of people, but a lot of it was tutorials or even one-on-one with students. So it's a very human scale. The Father Peter Millward, the Jesuit, the late Jesuit, was actually a student of C.S. Lewis and attended lectures of Tolkien. And it seems to be that Lewis was a much better presence as a teacher. He had this deep voice and this sort of charism. They talked about it sort of almost like his lectures being like a stage performance. He would just walk in at the appointed hour, would not say nothing, walk in, just begin his lecture right? Probably with an emphatic something, explosive start, and they just walk out at the end. Whereas apparently Tolkien would mutter and mumble, and you had to listen carefully to work out what he was actually saying. I'm sure it was great and fantastic, but I don't think he had the
stage presence,
and the charisma and the pedagogical gifts of C.S. Lewis.
So he would deliver lectures. Do you have any idea how? I mean, I've heard this. Like they would deliver lectures and then tutor. Was it like a lecture every day? Was it like lecture once a week? And then he'd have a bunch of students. He'd have like a class of 3 or 4 guys in one class, and then sometimes one-on-one. I mean, is that kind of how it went?
Well, I think you're getting too much detail for me. Someone who's never been to Oxford, and certainly been to Oxford in the 1920s. You're going to have to ask someone who knows more about those things than I do.
It seems, yeah, that's fine. It seems like it's such a better lifestyle as a professor, because ours, which our way, you show up, you got to teach 5 classes, and it's all 20 to 30 students, and it kind of stinks,
Well, it's better for professors, it's better for the students.
Way better.
Because obviously you're getting a lot of one-on-one attention from the professor. The professor knows the students. They're not just faceless people, amongst a couple of hundred. It's a humane.
Right.
That humanities are meant to be humane on all levels, and that's a humane way of teaching the humanities.
And these were my understanding is these were more like directed study courses where you're meeting with the professor and they say, okay, by the time you're done here, you need to kind of know all of this stuff. Mm-hmm. There wasn't necessarily like second semester, sophomore year, you're supposed to do X. It was, we're going to work through Beowulf. We're going to work through, Boethius, or we're going to work through, whatever. I mean, and you were going to work through these people. And the professor would say, so what's your experience with this, this author? And then you deliver that. And he said, okay, so you have to focus on this and you're going to focus on that. And it was very customized.
Yeah, customized, but also no hand holding. What was expected of the students was self-volition. That they need to be doing it themselves. They're getting guidance, they're getting correction, but they're not getting someone basically holding their hand and saying, "This is look at this passage, talk about it," and they explicate it with the professor, or the professor explicates it for you. Right. No, you're meant to go out. You're meant to read. You're meant to know. There's another wonderful story. George Sayer, who is a student, friend of Tolkien's, student of Lewis, when he went to be interviewed by Lewis to become his student, Lewis just started asking questions about literature, and he said, "Who are your favorite poets?" George Sayer said G.K. Chesterton was one of the ones he mentioned, and Lewis lit up immediately and started quoting from memory from the Ballad of the White Horse by Chesterton. But then George Sayer took it up and actually continued the quote from memory, and he said that's what got me. That's what got me, Lewis as a tutor.
Wow, that's cool. Very cool. Yeah. So he's a professor. He's lecturing. He's tutoring, and he's having kids, right? So, do we know when he started writing things down, or when did this language of Elven start bearing fruit as Middle Earth?
Well, the earlier stories were being written during World War I. I say a lot of them are not finished. They're sort of what we might call sketches, ideas for stories. He's got. So sometimes that Christopher Tolkien's done a 12-volume history of Middle Earth, and the thing about Tolkien, you have this image of the writer, frustrated writer between the 2 world wars with this typewriter, and of course you couldn't there's no word program where you just make your corrections. So if you messed up, you just take it out the typewriter, screw it up into a ball and throw it, and you've got this image of writers with piles of rejected, screwed up pieces of paper all end up in the rubbish bin. But Tolkien didn't do that. He'd take it out of the typewriter nice and neatly and lay it down. So all of these are left when Tolkien dies, and Christopher Tolkien starts collating them together. But it's difficult to know which of those, he actually, if he'd been a different sort of writer, would have just thrown away. I think he kept a lot of them, not because he ever wanted to see them published, but because there might be some ideas in there that would be the germ, to germinate something else. So just don't throw it away, because there's a couple of good ideas in there. It's not any good of itself, but then these all gather up, and then Christopher Tolkien stitches them all together. So this is very, very difficult to disentangle things that were works in progress by Tolkien, or things that were rejects but not disposed of. So this is, Tolkienologists, people that, I'm not a Tolkienologist. Tolkienologists are people that they spend their whole life just studying Tolkien. I'm far too interested in other people, other writers, and other things, history and the rest, to spend all my time on Tolkien. So I haven't spent a lot of time doing this, but it must be a bit of a nightmare to try to work out which ideas were actually works in progress from which were rejected ideas that he just hadn't got rid of. And Christopher Tolkien to sort of put all together,
Well, I wrote one novel, which you endorsed, which I'm grateful of, grateful for. And one of the things I noticed is you're developing a character. And my mind would often say, okay, let's say I'm creating John Smith, just make up something. If you really want John Smith to be a good character, John Smith has a history. Who's John Smith's dad? Who's his mom? Does he have siblings? Where did he go to school? If I opened up, his briefcase, what's in it? A pack of baseball cards is in it. Why? Well, where did he get that? Well, a friend gave it to him. And I did this, and I was just like, I'd see something like as silly as like a pack of baseball cards, and it's like, well, there's a whole story there. How did it get? Why does this man have, whatever? Oh, he loves baseball. He had experiences with his dad with baseball, and you go back and back and back, and you keep going. That's how you write, I think, a good novel where the final story is the fruit of an elaborate world that you've created, and the readers would never know how much of that history didn't make it. But hopefully all of those backstories created a character that's more believable, more real, and better emotion is given to that character, better words are given to that character. And so much so that when I finished the novel, and I don't know, at least 12 people or so are going to read this, so is it. But after you finish the novel, you're like, am I going to write a sequel? And like, well, I could write a whole story just about this one character, right? Just this whole. So that gave me a little snippet into how something like this happened, where the Lord of the Rings is the byproduct of something so much grander.
That's extremely perceptive. You've spoken as a novelist, as an author, because you're right. I mean, that's the one good thing about all of these piles of papers, whether they're works in progress or rejects. It does give to Middle Earth as a place an ancient history. It's a place that's not just the fruits of Tolkien's imagination, it's the roots of Tolkien's imagination. So that the characters that are in the present, in the Lord of the Rings, have with them this living heritage. Now, whether it's the history of the Shire, whether it's the history of the elves, whether it's the history of men, or the history of the dwarves, it's all there because Tolkien's already done a lot of thinking about this and writing about this, right? So he knows it. And he just gives enough of a smattering of the sort of the feel for the ancient history to make the present moment in the Lord of the Rings alive, because it's a real place with a real past. If the present does not have reality unless it has a past. It's two-dimensional, right? And one-dimensional, in fact. One of the mysteries of time. Get a bit abstract and metaphysical here, but it's triune. It's a trinity, because that time has to have a past, has to have a present, and has to have a future. And if you remove any of those three dimensions of time, the whole thing collapses. So you can only have a believable present, right? If there's a believable past behind it.
Yes. So in your own mind, I mean, you might be speculating, which is fine, but like you see him kind of in your mind, is this his hobby, right? He's teaching all day. He goes home. He's got 4 kids. His wife probably wants him to do household things. Hey, fix the sink, whatever he's got to do. Do the yard work. In his spare time, though, he's probably not playing the Xbox, right? I mean, he's not channel surfing, and he's not flipping through Instagram, right? He's probably sitting down with his notebook and his pipe, and doodling essentially these little stories of things, right? And eventually, if he likes it enough, maybe it gets typed up or whatever he did. So this is just happening over a long period of time, right? Now in his head, all of these things were probably connected somehow because he sees something kind of taking shape, and maybe the underlying current is the Elvish language and the Elvish mythology, I suspect. But at some point he probably saw, I should probably turn all this dibble-dabble stuff I'm doing into something that can make money because my kids are growing. My wife probably wants more money. I mean, I'm just guessing that he's a normal dude and has that reality. He says, I should probably try to sell this at some point.
Well, actually, I'm going to say no. In some sense, one of the most romantic, wonderful things about Lord of the Rings. We get backtrack to the Hobbit in a minute, which is slightly different. The Hobbit comes first, but the thing about the Lord of the Rings is the publisher wanted the Hobbit was a huge success, but Tolkien didn't write it. He wrote it for his own children. He wasn't writing it for a publisher.
Really?
So we'll come to that in a moment. But what the publisher wanted, because the Hobbit was a huge success, was the Hobbit 2, right? Son of the Hobbit. The Hobbit rides again. A sequel. And Tolkien begins writing the Lord of the Rings as a sequel to the Hobbit. And then it grows up, it grows out of control, it grows big, it grows dark, right? It grows grown up. It's no longer a children's book. Right. And not only is it now no longer a children's book, it's actually unpublishable, he thinks. Because no one's ever written a sort of an epic fantasy about elves and wars before. No one's going to be interested in this. And so he basically continues to write it as a labor of love, and he only reason he finished it was because of the encouragement of friends like C.S. Lewis. In fact, Tolkien said, if it hadn't been, he said, Lewis is not an influence on me in the usual understanding of the word, but he was a great encourager. And if it wasn't for Lewis's encouragement, I probably would not have finished The Lord of the Rings. So in other words, he wasn't writing it for money. Now, The Hobbit, on the other hand, there's a wonderful story about The Hobbit, because the opening sentence of The Hobbit is one of the most famous and one of the most charming opening lines of all of the literature. It was the best of times and the worst of times. The Tale of Two Cities, right? Very memorable first lines, but in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, period, right? That's a very, very memorable, and that was written, Tolkien, one of the most onerous, boring, I can testify to this, the most boring part of being an academic is grading papers. Tolkien's in this examination room, and he's sitting there, and he's supposed to be sort of grading papers, and then he gets bored. So he turns one of the papers over, and on the back, he just writes, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit," period. And that was the beginning of that story, a moment of boredom. And then he wrote it essentially at first for his own children. In 1937 was published. Let's say he's writing it in mid-1930s. His youngest child, Priscilla, was born in 1929. So the youngest child would have probably been about 6 or 7, and the others would have been a little bit older. John, the eldest, would probably be maybe a bit too old for The Hobbit, but he was writing it for his own children,
So if he was writing in the 30s, then, and he was born in 1892, that would have made him like in his 40s when he was writing this.
Yes.
So he really wasn't that young of a man. I mean, and so his kids were probably, some of his kids were probably older. Some of them were probably younger.
I think if his wife was pregnant in 1916, John would have been born in 1970.
Yeah, teenagers. Okay.
So late teenagers in his case. But then Priscilla, the youngest, was 1929.
Okay,
so she'd been about 6. Okay, when he was writing The Hobbit.
So it might have been even more for her.
Yeah, for the younger children. He was writing it for the younger children. Yeah.
Now on that note, I have a beautiful edition my dad gave to me from Easton Press, which is like the most beautiful books ever. And it's his Father Christmas letters to his children. They're wonderful. They're illustrated. Like he a good little drawer, he drew like snowmen and Santa Claus. And there are these letters from Father Christmas to his children about, being good and getting presents. And they're wonderful, but he did it every year for years.
Yeah. There's some wonderful stories about this as well, because obviously when your children get older, they get a bit skeptical, right, about whether Father Christmas really exists. So Tolkien went to some elaborate lengths. So one of my favorite was, that there was a nice carpet in the living room, right? Tolkien put on a pair of big boots and got them muddy and walked across the new carpet
See Edith
and put the letter on the mantelpiece and walked out again. I presume he parts, told his wife he was going to do it first, but the kids got up and thought, well, there's no way that it must have been Father Christmas.
That's not Dad's feet.
Yeah, that's exactly that mud on the carpet. You never. And another one, he got the postman in on the conspiracy, and he designed a sort of little North Pole postage stamp.
That's awesome.
Put it on the envelope and put the letter in there and gave it to the postman to deliver. So
see, that's so awesome. I mean, this shows he was really into this dad thing.
Exactly, he's a good father, good paterfamilias.
That's my next question was: do you have a sense from studying his life that he was a good father, or was he, a distant, cold academic kind of thing? But it sounds like he was a very affectionate father. Make sure to follow @Conor Gallagher Show on Instagram and Facebook. It's there where you can engage with the content much deeper, behind the scenes footage, behind the scenes content. It's going to be fascinating. Now back to the episode.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I love about those Father Christmas letters is precisely it does show the inside of the Tolkien family home, right? This is Tolkien's paterfamilias, his father of a family, and clearly a doting, loving father. And we see this in his letters, Tolkien's published letters, right through when after his children had grown up and getting married themselves, that he continued, and you just look at the letters, very close relationship with his children.
Do you know if that continued throughout the rest of his life?
Yeah, I mean, he was two of his sons lapsed from the faith, and that hurt him. There's some letters where he talks about that. He talks in one thing. When I think about my mother, living in a postman's cottage in Rednall, too sick for viaticum, and what she did for us to keep Hilly and I holding the faith, and my own children drift away. It's very hard and bitter. I know, because he saw his mother as a martyr, the sacrifice she made to, first of all, be a Catholic herself, and then to pass that on to her sons, and then and it's the usual. It wasn't the lack of the disagree with doctrine. It's because they had marital infidelities and messy personal lives, and they live irregularly. They put themselves in mortal sin and walk away. I mean, it's the messiness of human life,
What do you know about his marriage? We just talked about him as a father. What about him as a husband, and what was his wife like? Yeah, well,
that there's a lot of damage was done by Humphrey Carpenter, the first biographer, of Tolkien, and it really, I don't want to say anything, God rest his soul. But, Humphrey Carpenter was the son of the Bishop of Oxford, and his father was a friend of Tolkien's, a friend of the family. So he got the exclusive right to the official biography of Tolkien following Tolkien's death. But it was at a time when Humphrey Carpenter was struggling with his own Christianity and becoming somewhat skeptical, and not just skeptical, that would be one thing, but cynical. And so there's an air of cynicism about it, and one that plays itself out in not wanting to see Tolkien's marriage as being happy, but there's no evidence, and the only evidence he says is that Edith wasn't interested in the academic world. She wasn't interested, and so Tolkien had to sort of indulge his deeper discussions on philology or what have you with his friends. He couldn't do it with Edith. Well, big deal. I mean, many marriages are
join the club.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that Chesterton says that having granting divorce on the basis of incompatibility is absurd, because every marriage is an incompatibility. A marriage is only going to work if both partners in the marriage are making it work, right? It's not because we agree with everything all the time and we're soulmates and joined at the hip. No, in fact, vive la différence. I mean, one of the things that can make the marriage most beautiful is the fact that we don't have the same interests, that we do things separately. We come together and do some things together, but other things we're doing because I'm not interested in and you're not interested in this. Fine, you do that, I'll do this, and we do these things together.
Right.
I mean,
my wife is way smarter than I am, but I'm the one that spends all the time like reading stuff, and I have interesting conversations like this one. And you know, she's running a huge organization at the house. You know, I mean, she's just making trains run on time.
Yeah.
And if I went home and she stopped all that and we sat around and she said, "So, you know, let's talk about Bernard of Clairvaux today." You know, my kids aren't going to eat. You know, it's like, you want to talk about Bernard of Clairvaux or eat food. You know, I mean, so. You know, on a day-to-day basis, I can totally understand Edith being like, you know, I don't need to hear about Beowulf today.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why don't you just help me with dinner and do the yard work? You know, that's life.
And it's quite clear from reading Tolkien's letters how much he loved his wife. They stayed together until death did them part, and everything Humphrey Carpenter sort of said in that Bhagavad Gita, tried to sort of pour cold water on their marriage, was really, you know, when he went back and revisited it, it was without substance. It was just him sort of sneering, you know, and he didn't want it to be a happy marriage. So any differences were magnified and accentuated, and you know, but they're the sort of differences that every good and happy marriage has.
Yeah.
I mean, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Where does the Inklings fit into all of this? I mean, time-wise, interest, like were they hanging out? Was Edith, you know, making dinner for them and they're sitting around their living room talking about, you know, Narnia? Or were they just every Wednesday night he left and went to the pub? Like, how did all this work, and what was all that about, and when did it happen?
Well, the interesting thing about it was that how it began. So Tolkien formed a club called the Coalbiters, so Kolbitars, which literally means in Old Norse, coalbiters. In other words, those that sit so close to the fire in winter that they're almost biting the coal.
Okay.
And actually, if you allow me, I want to evoke a scene here, because we forget this. You know, home is where the heart is true, but it's abstract, right? Home is where the hearth is true, and it's concrete. You know, before electricity and central heating and artificial light, you know, in other words, up until about 200 years ago, or less than that, 150 years ago, right? The only heat and the only light in the winter was the hearth.
Yes.
Right. And if you come from the north, right, like the Vikings, the Old Norse that they're talking about, the Coalbiters, or indeed England, you know, in midwinter in England, it doesn't get light till about 9:30 in the morning. It's dark by 3. I mean, you know, wow. So, and what do you do? The only light you've got is the fire. You can't burn candles; they're expensive, right? You might have the candles walk from one place to another, but everyone huddles around the fire. That's where the light and the warmth is, and they tell stories or read, right, or sing. And they commune, right? The home is where the hearth is. So this whole evocation of the Coalbiters for this club that Tolkien found, and he found it for one reason only, so they could read the Elder Edda, which is a Norse saga in the original Old Norse. So you can imagine this is not a club with tens of thousands of members.
Yeah, if you want to be the president of that club, you go ahead, buddy.
So Tolkien and there's a handful of his fellow nerds.
It's a nerd club.
It's a nerd club. No, the philologists, you know, other members of the philology department at Oxford University, basically getting together, and Lewis, who didn't speak Old Norse but loved the Norse sagas, begged to be able to just sit in, right? And he had a crib and was trying to follow as best he could, all these good, you know, fluent in it. And when they'd finished reading the Elder Edda, that was the raison d'etre, the whole purpose of the club was fulfilled. It just ceased to be, right? It achieved its mission. But Lewis had a great need, a psychological need. Bear in mind, Lewis is a single man, right? Not a married man this time, that has this need for male friendship, camaraderie, conviviality, intellectual engagement about things that they all share a love for. So that was the birth of the Inklings, that, you know, that he then said, well, we should just meet anyway and just discuss literature and maybe read our own stuff, you know, what we're writing. And so that's the birth of the Inklings. And they would meet twice a week normally, once in Lewis's rooms in Magdalen College in Oxford. So
his rooms, meaning
his office.
His office.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. His study, whatever. Yeah, they call it rooms, but yeah, he's
not his house.
Okay. No, he had his own suite of office, study, library, where he would
basically his classroom.
Yeah,
Probably.
exactly.
Yeah.
The tutorials would be held there, etc. So they'd meet in Lewis's rooms once a week, and they'd also meet in the Eagle and Child pub, which they called the Bird and Baby. That was their nickname for it. And so they'd meet twice a week. Lunchtime in the Bird and Baby, normally, and evenings in Lewis's rooms. And then that met from the late 1920s right through to Lewis's death in 1963.
Wow.
So yes, it went on. Now, Tolkien did not go so often after about 1950 or so, in the early 50s, but certainly for the first 20 or so years, he was a regular member.
Who else was in that group?
Well, the other well-known members would be Charles Williams, the novelist. Now he worked in London, so he wasn't there all the time. Owen Barfield, who was a lawyer, also worked in London, wasn't there all the time. Others were other academics. I think Tolkien's own doctor, Dr. Havard, who is a Catholic, he attended. So I think it was just sort of the inner coterie of mutual friends. And you had occasional visitors, the Catholic poet Roy Campbell.
That's what I was about to say.
Yeah, he attended a few times in just after World War II.
So the very first group, the Coal-Biters, like, you had to basically know, what was the language that they were reading?
Old Norse.
Old Norse, yeah. So there's like 3 people in the universe that know that. But expanded out, and it was just a group of literary buddies that would get together.
Yeah, and Tolkien read, for instance, The Lord of the Rings, chapter by chapter. Lewis read his own works, The Chronicles of Narnia, chapter by chapter. So yeah, you imagine, exciting place. And people talk about the Bloomsbury group, the sort of woke left people, whatever, as being this very important literary clique from between the 2 world wars. But compared with the Inklings, right, they're irrelevant. The greatest works, largest selling works of literature of all time, I think Lord of the Rings is the 3rd largest selling ever, behind Don Quixote and Tale of Two Cities. The Hobbit is somewhere buzzing around the top 10. The Lion, the Witch and Wardrobe is buzzing around the top 10. So this one group, you've got 3 of the top 20 best-selling works of literature of all time from that one group alone.
Amazing. So it was in these groups that Lewis encouraged him to, hey man, you got to publish this. You got to finish this and publish it.
Yeah. So basically, it was only because of Lewis really encouraging me. He carried on reading each chapter, finished it, and then Lewis wrote a private read it, and he said that I can't think of anything that I've read, in the epics, it's just better than this. And this is not sort of an endorsement that for public consumption. This is just private correspondence. So it's Lewis telling Tolkien this is just great, world class.
All right, so there is a difference in the. I'm going to say somehow the wrong way and make somebody mad, but it does seem to me to be a difference in the substance or the weight or the meatiness of Lord of the Rings from Narnia or the Space Trilogy. So was it kind of strange for like Tolkien to be reading this kind of weighty masterpiece that was the fruit of decades of work and language and mythology, and then Narnia, no offense to Narnia fans or to Narnia authors like yourself, write about it, but kind of looks like something he could have written over the weekend. I mean, not that it's cheap, but there's not this backstory to it. It's just very short and very to the point. Is that fair, or maybe totally not fair?
No, it's fair. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is a magnum opus. It's one of the great books of Western civilization. It's an epic. It's not a novel. So you see the Lord of the Rings is, if you want to say where does Lord of the Rings fit into the canon of Western literature, it'd be on the same shelf as the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, Beowulf, Paradise Lost, Dante's Divine Comedy. It's an epic. So yeah, I mean, obviously the Chronicles of Narnia are children's stories. They don't have that level of gravitas.
So he wasn't trying to do what Tolkien did. Clearly, I mean, it was a different purpose, right?
Yeah, I mean, Lewis believed his greatest work of literature was Till We Have Faces, which is also his last, and that's the subtitle of that is A Myth Retold. And that's where Lewis is trying to do what Tolkien did, and I think succeeding. And I think Lewis thought he succeeded. So that book has gravitas, depth, and it's perplexing and puzzling. People read it and don't necessarily get it because it's not teaching. One of Lewis's weaknesses, well, obviously it's a strength at Oxford University, but as a writer, one of his weaknesses is his preachiness. His desire to teach and preach. And if a reader becomes aware that the author is preaching to them, it's normally it kills the relationship between the author and the reader, and the reader's probably going to shut the book. So Lewis is gifted enough to not quite be preaching, but he's always teaching, not letting the story speak for itself, but having to put some little lessons in there, which we're supposed to get, But Until We Have Faces, he doesn't do that. And it's a very profound work that speaks on a much deeper level because he doesn't do that.
So they're reading this together back and forth. They're probably encouraging each other. And then Tolkien eventually publishes Lord of the Rings. Did he make a fortune like right out of the gate?
Pretty much, yes. And one thing people don't realize is that Lord of the Rings just continued to be popular. So it was popular when it was first published in the 1950s. But then in the 1960s, rather bizarrely, it became very popular with the hippie subculture. And so the 1960s, and you got bands like Led Zeppelin and Queen and other artists that are clearly hugely influenced by the Lord of the Rings. So which I can imagine Tolkien by this stage being in his 70s and very much
scratching his head.
Where's this coming from? But then it continued to be very popular. So one of the big mistakes is to think that the Lord of the Rings, we have to thank Peter Jackson for the fact it's very popular. My first book on Tolkien Man and Myth, I wrote it because I was provoked by the response of the critics to the fact that The Lord of the Rings was voted in several opinion polls in the UK as either the greatest work of the 20th century or in one poll, the greatest work of all time. So they were dismissive of it. And one critic said, this just shows the folly of teaching people to read. So that's how negative they were towards it. So I thought, well, I'm gonna write a book saying exactly why this is a profoundly great masterpiece of Western literature. So that was what provoked me to write that. But the point is, that was late 1990s. The first of the Lord of the Rings movies think about 2001. So Tolkien was still being voted the greatest work of the 20th century of all time, 5 years before Peter Jackson. And of course, the Jackson films then a whole new generation again because of the movies. So, but it's almost like every decade there's been a rediscovery of the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, before we get more into the story and the themes and the imagery of Lord of the Rings, let's talk about his faith. We've talked about his family, his education, his Catholic faith. That was a major thing. And what do you want to say about that?
A lifelong practicing Catholic. It's quite clear that the faith was the most important thing in Tolkien's life. That it made sense of everything else. That everything else was informed by it. That any depth he has, any profundity. Lord of the Rings. I mean, he said of the Lord of the Rings. I'm quoting him word for word here. The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work.
Bingo.
Unconsciously at first, consciously in the revision. That's what he said. So, his greatest masterpiece is fundamentally religious and Catholic. So everything he did was informed by, and I mean informed in the philosophical sense, but informed by that. The form of it is Catholic. So we can't separate Tolkien's work from his faith. That's the bottom line. One thing we should say about this as well is that the influence of Tolkien on Lewis's conversion to Christianity, because this dates back to I'll get the date right now, August the 16th, September the 19th, 1931. September 19th, 1931. It's what Lewis called a long night talk. So this is in Lewis's rooms, presumably after one of the Inklings meetings. But most people drifted off home, and it was just Tolkien and Lewis and come to me, another friend, and they, in the course of the conversation, discussing one of their favorite topics, myth, right, mythology, and Lewis said, "But myths are lies, and therefore worthless, even though breathed through silver." In other words, that we like myths because they're beautiful, right? And we enjoy them because they're beautiful, but they don't tell us the truth. And then ultimately, when it comes down to it, they therefore have no value. And Tolkien said, no, they are not lies. And then he began to enunciate what I call his philosophy of myth, the love of wisdom to be found in stories, right? And he says that Christianity is a myth like all the others, except it's the true myth that really happened. Capital T, capital M. And the difference is, whereas we write our stories with words, we are sub-creators, right? Using words to tell stories. God, as the creator, uses history to tell his story. Salvation history is the greatest story ever told. The author of the story enters the story himself. And then we have the greatest story within the greatest story, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so for Tolkien, all the other stories, if you like, are types of this archetype. And in that sense, in Tolkien's words, they contain splintered fragments of the one true light. Evangelion, the good news of the gospel, is to be found in other stories, because we are made in the image of God. We're made to be storytellers. God is a storyteller. I mean, within the story, how does Christ teaches his most valuable lessons through his life, right? And his actions and his death, his resurrection. But within the story, he tells us stories within the story, parables. So the story of the prodigal son is a fictional narrative, right? But we don't say that the prodigal son is like us. We say we are like the prodigal son, because the prodigal son, the fictional character, is more real than we are, because we're like him. He's the archetype, because we're all prodigal sons, right? Our envious brothers or forgiving fathers. I mean, the characters in the story are all archetypes of who we are. So Christ can tell a fictional story and have it telling profound truth. So our own fictional stories are designed to do the same thing, and the greatest do that. The Lord of the Rings is one of the greatest does that, which is why Tolkien can say fundamentally religious and Catholic.
I remember being in college and really studying ancient Greek literature with the great Henry Russell, by the way, who you know.
I do.
And I remember having, certainly not a crisis of faith, I never had that, but seeing how much something like Achilles being part God, part man, you know, and God coming down and mating with a woman, and, you know, all of this Greek mythology had all of these elements to it. And thinking, wait a minute, if I was more skeptical, I could easily see Christianity as just a more refined version of these kinds of ancient myths. It's the Jewish version of what the Greeks and Romans had, and so much of that, you know, it was present. But then something very quickly kind of dawned on me that said, no, wait a minute. Christianity, that's the true story, and all of these other things are foreshadowing of this. So you have this natural law that's like built in to all the Greek and Roman poets, and they saw this, they tapped in somehow to the truth of reality where God would be touching man. And it was not that they knew they were foreshadowing of the Messiah, but their appreciation of truth somehow got them to that reality where, yeah, God and man are meant to come together somehow, some way. And so they created a very imperfect version of what we would fully experience in Christ. And perhaps that's related to this notion of this is the true myth, and all these other ones are imperfect myths.
Right, exactly. And so I'm going to speak directly to what you just said there, and I agree with you. But just to backtrack, because I'm going to lead to C.S. Lewis referring to what you've just been talking about. So within 3 weeks of that conversation, that long night talk with Tolkien, Lewis wrote to his friend Arthur Greaves in Northern Ireland that he'd definitely started to believe in the Christian God. And the long night talk with Tolkien and the other fellow whose name's escaping me, Hugo Dyson. Thank you very much from the audience there. Thank you. Yeah, Hugo Dyson. The long night talk with Tolkien and Dyson had a great deal to do with this. So this idea of the true myth. Now that Lewis is thinking like Tolkien, this is what Lewis says about the pagan myths. He says that the difference between the true pagans from before Christ and the neo-pagans of our own time is the difference between a virgin and a divorcee. That the virgin is awaiting the coming of the bridegroom, and therefore you can see this desire for the truth that will be fulfilled in Jesus Christ in the paganism before Christ, whereas the neo-paganism in recent times is the divorcee that walks away from the marriage. And there's the difference between the virgin and the divorcee.
Wow. What an incredible analogy.
Yeah.
Why does my mind think now of A Hero of a Thousand Faces? That comes to mind here. And maybe it's because you have like a handful. I never read that whole book, but I dabbled in it. You know what I'm referring to?
No, I don't actually.
Okay.
Enlighten me.
Kevin, Google that name. A Hero of a Thousand Faces. It was kind of a classic work that says like there's a handful of archetype stories in humanity, and every type of story fits into 5 or 6 different types of stories. You have there you go.
Joseph Campbell. Yeah,
right,
of course.
right,
Yeah.
And it's there's just this reality that authors tap into.
Yeah.
And if you're trying to create something, whether it's Lord of the Rings or Narnia or the Odyssey, whatever it is, you can't help but fall into just a handful of types.
Yeah,
all of which are connected to eternal truth in some form or fashion.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's very simple as far as I can see it. That we just return back to the classical understanding of who we are. If we are the 3 classical labels for who we are, one Greek, anthropos, he looks up in wonder. We talked about that already. So he who's seeking beauty and the transcendence of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Anthropos. But the other aspects of it are homo viator, man on a pilgrimage, pilgrim man on a quest. That the purpose of life is to achieve the quest. From a Christian perspective, the purpose of life is to get to heaven, right? So each of us is on a journey or a pilgrimage or a quest, but also the reason that the pilgrimage is a struggle is simultaneously, as well as being homo viator, pilgrim man, we are homo superbus, proud man. And the proud man doesn't want to go on the quest. He doesn't want to go on the pilgrimage. He wants to go somewhere else, or maybe go nowhere in particular, just hang around, right? So that struggle, as great writers such as Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn tell us, that struggle between homo viator and homo superbus just means proud man. The Latin word for pride is superbia. So homo superbus, proud man versus homo viator, pilgrim man. That battle goes on in each individual human heart. And that's the battle between good and evil. So each of us is a civil war, right? So clearly every story somehow is going to manifest, our telos, the journey we're meant to be on, the virtuous path, and the rejection of the virtuous path and the struggle between the two. I mean, if it's true, as Tolkien says, that fairy stories, and I would say all stories, literature holds up a mirror to man, shows us ourselves, well, that's what it's showing us. So obviously they're going to be archetypes, because that's basically, it's all going to center upon that struggle between homo viator and homo superbus, and also the quest for beauty, anthropos.
Amazing. That's beautifully brought together. On his spirituality, his Catholicism, you had us before the show cue up a letter he wrote to his son about the Eucharist. Kevin, you want to pull that up? And what's the context of this? And it's just one of the most powerful things probably ever written from a father to a son. Yeah.
So basically, the key thing is that Tolkien was always a good father, and obviously the thing he wanted to ensure that his children kept was their Catholic faith, and that's obviously his role as father. And of course, when they become grown-ups, they get married, and that becomes more difficult. His daughter Priscilla remained a lifelong practicing daily communicant right up until her death. His eldest son became a priest. But the other two sons had, problematic paths. So this is a letter written to one of those sons in which he's sort of trying to, should we say, center his son in the ultimate reality, which is the presence of Christ in the Blessed Sacrament.
Do you know if this was written to Christopher or to another?
No, I think this one was written to Michael, if I remember correctly. I think it was written to Michael.
You want to read it?
Yes. Out of the darkness of my life, so much frustrated, I put before you the one great thing to love on earth, the Blessed Sacrament. There you will find romance, glory, honor, fidelity, and the true way of all your loves upon earth. And more than that, death. By the divine paradox, that which ends life and demands the surrender of all, and yet by the taste or foretaste of which alone can what you seek in your earthly relationships, love, faithfulness, joy, be maintained or take on that complexion of reality, of eternal endurance, which every man's heart desires.
That is one packed paragraph.
I don't honestly, I don't know if I've ever read a better defense of the real presence of Christ in the Blessed Sacrament than those words of Tolkien in the private letter.
You want to unpack it for us a little bit? I mean, when you've read it many times. What does it mean to you?
But basically, that the Blessed Sacrament itself, the Eucharist, and our partaking of it at Mass and in communion is the very center of our being. It's where we get the only real nutrition and nourishment that's going to feed our souls as opposed to feeding our bodies. Lembas in the Lord of the Rings, the elvish waybread. That's all that Frodo and Sam have to sustain them while they're walking through Mordor, the Valley of Death. And Lembas in Elvish means life bread or bread of life. And we're told in the Lord of the Rings, it feeds the will more than the body. And the point is that the Blessed Sacrament feeds the will. If we have a relationship with Christ in the Blessed Sacrament, then it's that which is feeding our ability to be true to the Homo Viator we're called to be, and to overcome the Homo Superbus we're tempted to become. So that's the power of the real presence of Christ in the sacrament. And I think that's what Tolkien is trying to convey to his own children there.
I mean, I doubt he ever imagined that people other than his son, would read that.
Right.
But it's a remarkable defense of the Eucharist.
And thanks be to God for Christopher Tolkien, that he did actually compile those letters, and which contains that wonderful quote. Because if he hadn't done that posthumously, obviously after Tolkien's death, then we would not have these beautiful sayings of Tolkien.
Tan Books is here to help you become a saint. That's why we do everything we do. We publish thousands of titles, literally, that are specifically written to help you get to heaven. Everything from the lives of the saints to the writings of the saints, the greatest doctors of the church, the great spiritual masters, Alphonsus Liguori, St. Francis de Sales, and so on. So please come to tanbooks.com and find the book that God wants you to have right now so that you can get to heaven and be a saint for eternity.
So I think I'm going to write my adult children letters and write that quote about the Eucharist and not cite Tolkien, just so they can think I'm a brilliant dad.
Well, I know you've heard me quote this before, but I always quote T.S. Eliot. When someone says something really smart to me, I always say, well, that T.S. Eliot said that bad writers borrow, good writers steal.
Yeah,
so
perfect.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think Tolkien will mind if I plagiarize.
He's not going to care.
I'm not going to sell it, so it's good. That was an amazing overview of his life, his family, his roles of, as a soldier, as a student, as a young guy who was in love, an orphan, a soldier, and then a professor, a husband, a father, a friend to Tolkien. So we covered a lot. It was great. Let's now go to the point that you've already emphasized, and we've touched on some of these elements, but we'll go deeper into particularly the Catholic imagery or theological framework of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. What are some of the broad themes that stick out to you the most as like, okay, obvious, case number one, or evidence number one, exhibit number one, that's what I'm looking for. This is obviously, Catholic imagery. Here you go, people. So what are some of those major pieces of evidence?
Well, first of all, I'm pleased that you said The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, because I would like to spend a little bit of time on The Hobbit, because there's a profound theological depth to The Hobbit, even though it's a children's book as well, which we shouldn't be overlooking. Right. But come back what we said earlier, about the key ingredients of the Catholic dimension is the fact that both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are about a journey. Homo viator, man on the journey, about the temptations on the journey to not fulfill the quest, to give up. Homo superbus, right? At moments when darkness descends, and we discussed this also, to look up and see that above all shadows rises the sun, above all evil there is God. That Samwise Gamgee from Lord of the Rings said that. So anthropos, right? So these three classical understandings of who we are, these animate the works. Let me, if I can just sort of show how that illustrates in The Hobbit.
Sure.
So the dragon sickness in The Hobbit is basically being possessed by your possessions. So Smaug, the dragon, he's squatting on a huge mound of treasure under the lonely mountain. That's of no use to him whatsoever. He can't use any of it. It's useless. And what it's doing is actually imprisoning him. He's enslaved to it. He's chained to it. He daren't leave in case someone steals something. So he's actually possessed by his possessions. Wow. So, but the key thing is at the beginning of the Hobbit, right, we have Bilbo Baggins possessed by his possessions, because we're told right at the beginning, in the hole of God lived the Hobbit, but it's not a smelly, oozy hole, right? It's a Hobbit hole, and that means comfort. Right, so the Hobbit hole is the comfort zone. The Hobbit hole is where we've got everything around us, where we don't have to suffer, right? We don't have to anything inconvenience. It's about comfort. So that's why Gandalf says to Bilbo, you should go on this adventure because it will be good for you. He says, if you survive. Because the point is that Bilbo Baggins has to leave his hobbit hole in order to learn how to lay down his life for others, which is the act of love, right? If you're just in your hobbit hole by yourself, surrounded by your belongings, possessed by your possessions, you're not loving anybody. Right, so he has to learn to lay down his life for the dwarves, to pursue the quest, and when he returns back home, they're selling all of his possessions because he's presumed dead, right? He's returned home in time for his own funeral. But the irony of that is that he has died. The old Bilbo Baggins that left the Hobbit hole has died. The Bilbo Baggins that returns is a resurrected Bilbo Baggins. And that's why he says that the kettle singing on the hearth sung much more sweetly, because he now possesses the kettle on the hearth. The kettle on the hearth doesn't possess him.
And also the kettle was probably the least valuable of his possessions.
Yes, indeed.
His rugs and his artwork or whatever were
being
sold off, but he just wanted that simple thing. Man, I've read The Hobbit twice, like I said. Once when I was like in 8th grade. And it made an impact because I remember like where I was sitting when I started reading that. I remember exactly where I was. And I wasn't much of a reader. And I couldn't put it down. There's only a couple books, when I was a kid that really, really hit me. And then I read it again a couple years back when I was like, okay, I got to get through this whole thing, But I never noticed that. You're right. It starts with comfort. And he was suffering from a little bit of dragon sickness himself.
Yep.
And then he goes on this journey and he comes back, and he's a resurrected self. He's had death to self on this journey. His possessions are being sold off. Amazing. Like, who taught you that? I mean, and that's just one tiny example that you have with your reading. But who taught you that? I would have to read that somewhere and say, I have to read Joseph Pearce to get that. How do you read The Hobbit and get this?
Well, first of all, generally speaking, you don't just read it once. Most works of literature on the first reading, you don't get it. So you do have to return and delve and dive a little bit more deeply. But the key thing is, I think, is to learning to read literarily, to know that a work of literature doesn't just work on the literal level, it works on a literary level. In other words, levels of symbolic and allegorical meaning. So once you, it's a bit like we said, philology, a love of languages. Well, literary reading is a language in itself, and you have to learn that language. And when you learn how to read as literature and not merely as a literal story, then these sort of they leap out at you. They come out of you. It becomes much more easily. Can I tell a little joke, by the way?
Please.
Right, from me, based upon that. It's awful pun. It's not going to make you laugh. It's going to make you groan, right? But at the beginning of the story, we have Bilbo Baggins in his hobbit hole, surrounded by his possessions. The quest is to get the Lonely Mountain, where you got the huge dragon, on his huge pile of treasure, and he lives under the mountain. Bilbo Baggins lives in a hobbit hole under the hill. His actual address is under mountain. So I said the only difference between Bilbo Baggins and Smaug is a question of scale.
Scale.
Yeah, I told you, mate.
Oh, there's that's good.
Yeah, it's awful.
Now, did some 8th grader tell you that?
Yeah, it's a dad joke. It was a dad joke.
Okay. All right. So, but on this point, before we go into more examples, I mean, they want to hear from you talking about more examples, but a couple of my own projects recently, Joseph, have kind of shown me actually the answer to my question, like, how do you find this stuff? And I have experienced a few times recently of reading something with clear purpose, then you start seeing things. So for example, a book I'll shamelessly give you when you leave here is, I just finished a book called The Meekness and Humility of Jesus Christ. There's a point here, I promise. I learned in Matthew's gospel that he said, learn of me, only once. He didn't say learn of me because I'm powerful, because I do these miracles, because I'm all-knowing. He said, learn of me because I'm meek and humble of heart. And so that hit me like a ton of bricks one day. Father Paul Check, I don't know if you know him.
Yeah, very well. Yeah.
He told that to me on a phone call one day, just in passing, completely out of context for something else. And I said, that kind of hit me. So I told myself, Conor, you got to go back and read the Gospels and learn of him because he's meek and humble of heart. You have to go through the Gospels, all 4 right now, and read every passage looking for the lesson in meekness and humility. Mm-hmm. Not for the storyline, not for some great theological point, not necessarily looking at the miracles, whatever, but looking, you're investigating, you're like an archaeologist, you're digging for meekness and humility. So I did this, and the result was carefully reading in a very meditative way every single morning for 9 months. And it resulted in a book on what I consider like the top 40 scenes from his life through the 4 Gospels. And I picked 40 because it's a good biblical number. He could have gone way more. But looking at these kind of everyday passages that we hear all the time and said, okay, take the strangest example, driving the money changers out of the temple. Our Lord is infinitely meek, and he's all perfection. He's always virtuous in every situation. So how is he meek and humble when he makes a whip and drives people out? That's kind of one of the more shocking examples of, is he really meek, or did he just set meekness aside? So I have to read this passage over and over and over and open myself up to some inspiration from the Holy Spirit until and not move on day after day until I get some kind of revelation on, now I see the meekness that's present here. Now I see the humility here. And then I wrote about it. And that's my new book, is Meekness and Humility of Jesus Christ. Not trying to plug the book, but I learned in that project over 9 months, when you read something with incredible intentionality, what comes off the page is so radically different. Yep. And another thing I learned in that process is, in our Bible, we have these chapter breaks. We have verse breaks, we have chapter breaks. Somebody had to do that, they had to put in these chapter breaks. So when we hear passages at Mass, Joseph, you always hear them in a vacuum, right? Mm-hmm. You never will hear the end of Mark 4 and the beginning of Mark 5 at the same time. Now, when Mark wrote it, sitting in whatever cave he was sitting in, he just wrote a story. He didn't say end of chapter 4. That's not what he did, you know? Some guy in the Middle Ages did this. So the other thing I started to do in this process is look for these connecting themes between the stories of Scripture intentionally. So one example I've said a couple times, probably on the show, but Mark chapter 4, he calms the storm. You know, peace, be still. And the winds and sea obeyed him. You know, who is this man who can, command the wind and the sea? And the apostles are amazed, and they were upset because teacher, do you not care if we perish? And he's like sleeping in a boat, and he stands up and calms everything. It's an amazing scene. A master over the natural elements. End of Mark chapter 4. Beginning of Mark chapter 5. They land the boat, and he goes in, and there's a demoniac that comes out of the tombs who's running around causing this town all kinds of crazy problems, and he exorcises that demon right there on the spot. He's the master of the supernatural world. He's the master of the natural world, the master of the supernatural world. It's one story, but we have a chapter break.
Right.
And I have seen that time and time again. I think a wonderful little book would be the connecting themes, you know, in some of these scripture stories that we don't think is connected because we have these artificial breaks. We just have artificial breaks. Yep. So my point is that when you go back and you read a text that you're familiar with, and so you've probably read The Hobbit, you read The Lord of the Rings, you know the basic story. The first time you read it, you were just being receptive and receiving the story. Yeah. And Tolkien was just kind of talking to you. But now all of a sudden you start reading it with a new purpose. Like you're the Catholic guy who has to explain this stuff to everybody. So then you go back and you're reading it and you're looking for something very different than you were the first time. Now it's proactive reading. You're diving deep into it. And that's when you start extracting the deepest stuff in there possible. Does that resonate?
Absolutely. And your preamble from Scripture was a perfect archetype from which the other types of literary reading apply. It's what I call recreational reading is when we just read for fun. And there's nothing wrong with just reading for fun. But if we are reading for fun, we shouldn't pontificate on the basis that we know what we're talking about because we haven't tried to actually engage on any deeper level. It's not a literary reading at all. It's a recreational reading, and that's fine for fun. But if you really wanted to engage with other people about what's engaging in a text on deeper levels of meaning, you have to go back with intentionality and also, I would say, humility. I always every morning, one of my morning prayers is that my words be your words. But that's, if you like, two ways. I don't want to say anything which is not in conformity with the will of God, but also when I'm reading, I want the words that I'm reading to be His words. In other words, that I want to be able to see that the truth that's in that text being emanated to me. So in other words, you have to have a receptive reading needs to be a humble reading, right? You have to get yourself out of the way so that the silence can speak when the words are speaking to you. Yes, beautiful. Rather than you're imposing yourself upon it.
It is like meditation. It's like meditation.
Exactly. So it's not like, for instance, a doctor with a surgeon with a scalpel.
No.
Dissecting something. I mean, a living thing. I think the poet William Wordsworth said, "We kill to dissect." In other words, that when we dissect things, we kill them. A living thing should not be dissected. We should be looking for the life in it, and then enjoying and sharing that life with others. That's what we're doing. But in order to do that, you've got to listen. In order to listen, you have to be quiet. In order to be quiet, you have to be humble. Yes. There's humility that gives us the silence we need to be able to hear and see.
But I would say that I don't say like the average person, I don't know, but the average well-informed Catholic, who's heard Joseph Pearce say, this is a fundamentally Catholic and religious and Catholic work. If they pick up The Hobbit and they read it with that intentionality in mind, they're going to see things that they absolutely did not see the first time when it was just pure recreational reading. Yeah. And that's a beautiful thing that we can go back and it's reading the same book, but you're reading a very different book. It's a very different experience.
The great works of literature are living things. So, obviously we say that of Holy Scripture and everybody knows it. And of course, Holy Scripture is more alive than others. The others, any life that they have comes from that goodness, truth, and beauty, which is be seen in its fullness in the gospel and in Scripture. But these things are alive. So a great work that you go back and read Dante Divine Comedy, every time you're going to be struck by new things. Lord of the Rings, every time new things, right? Because these things are resonating with goodness, truth, and beauty. These are metaphysical realities, right? They're transcendent realities that you can't measure, quantify, weigh. So you go back to them and they will speak to you again if you are listening.
It's not that you can tell a man by the books he's read, but by the books he's reread.
Yeah.
Something like that.
That's good. I'll steal that one too.
Good. I got it from somebody.
There we are. So,
all right. So The Hobbit starts with Bilbo, a little bit of dragon sickness. So that's one incredible Catholic theme that you start with. Very first page of The Hobbit, you see it developing there. Give us some others. What are some other major themes that you see?
Well, I mean, with The Hobbit, because it is a children's book, most of the rest of it is examples of that being played out. So the mayor of a lake town, because of his pride, Homo superbus, he tries to run off with the gold. He has the dragon sickness and he dies of hunger in the desert, like Midas, right? So there are all sorts of lessons about, if you're Homo superbus, you suffer from the dragon sickness. If you don't recover from the dragon sickness, then you're killed by the dragon sickness. So Thorin Oakenshield on his deathbed realizes that he himself become possessed by the dragon sickness. And I can't remember the exact line now, but he basically says to Bilbo Baggins, if everybody was like you, that just enjoyed good song and didn't value gold, this would be a much better place. So he has his deathbed conversion where he's healed, if you like, from the dragon sickness on his deathbed. But this is the temptation, and it's the temptation, again, Homo Viator. Are we going to lay down our lives for others? Are we going to take up our cross? In other words, are we going to embrace suffering and lay down our lives for others? That's Homo Viator, what we're called to be. Or are we going to refuse? To choose or to refuse, right? So are we going to refuse that and become a Homo superbus and basically seek comfort, or to sacrifice others for ourselves rather than sacrificing ourselves for others? Because ultimately, it's not rocket science, right? The whole of our lives is a choice. We either lay down our lives self-sacrificially for others, or we lay down the lives of others self-sacrificially to ourselves, right? So there are two types of love, right? The one dies for the beloved and actually is resurrected through grace from that. The other kills the beloved and dies themselves in consequence.
Awesome. You've answered these things like at probably a million homeschool conferences and talks and everything, but how do you answer the question of who do certain people represent, right? I mean, your answer is probably many in different ways, but who is Gandalf? Is Gandalf Jesus? How do you handle that one?
Yeah, well, the first thing we have to do is to insist that Tolkien's much more subtle than, for instance, C.S. Lewis.
Yes.
So if you read the Chronicles of Narnia, the character of Aslan does represent the Son of God, in other words, Christ. At every moment that we see him or he's spoken about in all 7 of the stories, right? So that's very obvious.
Right.
In The Lord of the Rings, it's much more subtle. So no character represents Christ in that way. Every character is first and foremost who they are in the literal sense of who they are in the story. Yeah. But so you mentioned Gandalf. So Gandalf is within the story a wizard. If you the wider legendarium is actually some sort of angelic being, but that's another discussion. But insofar as he lays down his life at the Bridge of Khazad-dûm fighting a demon. That Balrog is a demon, a very powerful demon. He says, I am a servant of the secret fire. Now, we won't know what that means from the story. We do have to have that extra textual stuff. Tolkien tells us in one of his letters that the secret fire is the Holy Spirit.
Perfect.
Yeah, so I am a servant of the Holy Spirit, but insofar as he dies, and he does really die. We're told in the story he dies. It's not a fake death. He's not going to hide somewhere and twiddling his thumbs for a couple of hundred pages. He dies. But then when we see him again, right, he's no longer Gandalf the Grey. He's Gandalf the White. and his robes are so dazzling that you can't even look directly at them. It's like looking at the sun. So what we have is a transfigured Gandalf the White's transfigured, dazzling, and he has to put his grey cloak over, and it's like the sun going in, a cloud going before the sun. So we have death, resurrection, transfiguration, and in that we see a facet of Christ in Gandalf. So the other two obvious ones are Frodo. So this is okay. So the most important thing that unlocks Lord of the Rings, backtrack to get why Frodo is a Christ figure. Tolkien follows the literary device that the medievals use. So, for instance, to use dates from the liturgical year as clues to deeper allegorical meaning.
This is awesome. I love this.
Yeah. So, for instance, in the Divine Comedy begins on Maundy Thursday, on Holy Thursday, in the dark wood of sin. Dante descends into hell on Good Friday, following the footsteps of Christ. He emerges from hell in the light of day at the foot of Mount Purgatory on Easter Sunday morning. He ascends Mount Purgatory and ascends into heaven during the Easter season. So Beowulf, Tolkien's Beowulf, the final part against the dragon, Beowulf hand picks 12 warriors. Right. So immediately, if you're reading literarily, you think, handpicked 12, hang on, what's going on here?
Yeah,
right. Yeah. And then one of the 12 is the traitor who steals the goblet, steals the treasure, but raises the dragon's wrath. That necessitates Beowulf facing the dragon, obviously symbolic of the devil, facing the dragon in mortal conflict, and Beowulf will die to destroy the dragon. But it's the traitor. And then when Beowulf faces the dragon, all of the handpicked warriors run away to the woods except for one who stands by him.
Yeah,
right,
John,
exactly. And then the final lines of the poem, they build a burial mound to Beowulf on a headland, so it's like a lighthouse for ships to stop them getting shipwrecked. A burial mound on the headland as a memorial to him, so like the church. And there were 12 knights galloping around in a circle. So the 12 are restored, right? Yep. Judas, the traitor's been replaced, and it's galloping in a circle signifying eternity around the center, which is the church. All right. So Tolkien obviously was an expert on Beowulf and translated it and wrote a wonderful essay, lecture on it.
Yeah.
But also Sir Gawain the Green Knight, which Tolkien also translated.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. So that's another medieval classic. Begins and ends at Christmas.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Yes, right.
And Sir Gawain heads out on his quest. He announces he's going to go out on the quest to find the Green Knight on All Saints' Day. He goes to confession. He sets out on All Souls' Day, which is obviously a penitential day, right?
Yes.
He is then lost in the wilds of Wales, unable to find the Green Knight's castle for the entirety of Advent. So a penitential season in the desert, right, in the wilds. And he prays on Christmas Eve for somewhere to go to Mass, right? He wants to be able to go to Mass on Christmas. So he prays, and that's when the Green Knight's castle magically appears, and he gets to Mass on Christmas Day. So Tolkien, he's steeped in this liturgical symbolism that you see in the great works that he knows so well. So what happens? The Lord of the Rings. So the ring is destroyed on March the 25th. March the 25th is the Feast of the Annunciation, which of course is the date on which God becomes man, the Feast of the Incarnation, right? But also, Tolkien's a medievalist, and he knows his history and he knows his tradition. That traditionally, the date of the crucifixion is also March the 25th. Now, we forget that because, of course, Good Friday is a movable feast, right? Because Easter's not the same time every year. So we don't ascribe a particular date for Good Friday. But the crucifixion itself happened on one particular historical day. And according to tradition, that's March the 25th. So March 25th is much more important than Christmas.
Wow.
You know, imagine, for instance, I've given talks on Lord of the Rings at Harvard, at Columbia University, at various state universities. Imagine you've got a secular audience. And what I say is, look, so March the 25th, right, is the Feast of the Annunciation. right? This is when God becomes man, right? Not Christmas.
Yes.
9 months later, right? Because life begins at conception,
yes.
right? And you can say that to a secular audience, right? So March the 25th, Feast of Annunciation, date of the crucifixion. This is the date on which Tolkien has the ring destroyed.
Wow.
So what's destroyed? What's destroyed by the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ? The power of sin.
Yes.
Right? What is the ring? The one ring to rule them all, in the darkness bind them. What's original sin? The one sin to rule them all, and in the darkness bind them. And the one ring and the one sin are both destroyed on the same significant date, March the 25th. And it gets even better, by the way, because Frodo leaves Rivendell on December the 25th and arrives at Mount Doom, Golgotha, on March the 25th. So Frodo's journey from Rivendell to Mount Doom is the life of Jesus from his birth to his death. So anyway, all marvelous stuff.
I love it.
It's all marvelous stuff.
Okay, so those dates kind of reveal, once you appreciate those dates, kind of obviously the ring represents original sin.
Yes.
And it's defeated by the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Yes. Exactly. So that's why Frodo is a Christ figure, because if the ring, if the ring symbolizes sin, right? So it's original sins and sin. So when you put the ring on, it's the act of sin, right? While you have the ring on, you become invisible to the good world that God's made because you've excommunicated yourself. You become more visible to Sauron, because you enter his world, right?
Yes.
So when a ring wearer is someone in mortal sin, shall we say, right?
Yes.
The more you put the ring on, the more addicted you become to its power. The more you want to have its power, the more you choose sin, choose the ring over everything else, like Gollum. And that's a perfect description. What happens? You Gollumize yourself. You become a shriveled, shrunken wreck.
That should be a word that goes in the dictionary.
It should be.
Gollumize
to Gollumize is a verb. I agree, absolutely.
Right.
And then, but if instead of being a ring wearer, you're a ring bearer, you carry the weight of sin without sinning, right? Then you're a cross bearer. And it's in that sense that Frodo, as the ring bearer and not the ring wearer, is a figure of Christ as the cross bearer. And that's why all these dates tie in with him.
Yeah, wow. Now go back to Bilbo, though. So he finds the ring and has, those little riddles with Gollum and everything. The allegory with Frodo as the ring bearer is much more tangible or much more direct. What is that in relation to Bilbo?
Well, the key thing here, the important thing is, we know that we're supposed to read the I'm going to say this now, just in case there are people watching, if they haven't switched off already. This sort of person might have switched off already anyway. That believe that literature is not that important, right? It's not as important as nonfiction. Fiction's not as important as nonfiction. That the great doctors of the church, St. Augustine of Hippo and St. Thomas Aquinas, make it clear that the Bible is literature, and you have to read the Bible on distinct allegorical levels.
Absolutely.
Right? So
four senses of Scripture.
The four senses of Scripture, exactly. So there were three allegorical levels of Scripture as well as the literal level. So we're meant to see things literarily in that way.
Yes.
So we do the allegorical level. The first of those levels of allegory is the fact that the Old Testament is an allegory of the New Testament, right? Typology. It points to, right? Everything in the Old Testament points to the New Testament, to its fulfillment in the New Testament. Well, what we can't and should not do is to see The Hobbit as it being an allegorical conversation.
Good. Yeah, I'm glad you said that,
with the Lord of the Rings, because when Tolkien wrote The Hobbit, he hadn't thought about the Lord of the Rings, right? So this deeper understanding of the power of the ring was not in his head.
Yeah.
So the ring that we see in The Hobbit is not the same powerful ring. I mean, but it is when you project it backwards. You can read The Hobbit in the light of the Lord of the Rings, but you can't read the Lord of the Rings in
light of the Hobbit.
In light of the Hobbit.
Right. I understand what you're saying.
No, you can't read The Hobbit in the light of the Lord of the Rings, but you can read The Lord of the Rings in the light of the Hobbit. Because Tolkien, at the beginning of the Lord of the Rings, goes to quite depth. So Gandalf discovers the ring is not what we thought it was. It's much darker than that, right? So that is revealed, but it wasn't even revealed to Tolkien when he wrote The Hobbit. Right.
The Hobbit is not a foreshadowing. It is not a typology of the Lord of the Rings.
Exactly.
It's just prefatory work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's so we mustn't see it exactly as the way the ring is seen in Lord of the Rings, because Tolkien did not see it that way when he wrote The Hobbit. The key thing is the dragon sickness in The Hobbit. That's which we've discussed already.
Right. The simplicity of the lowly, the meek and the humble hobbit being the hero of the story.
Of course.
So he kind of laid that groundwork.
Absolutely. Exaltation of the humble. That's a key part of the whole fact. The hobbits they're small, they're insignificant. That's why Sauron doesn't even know the ring is in the Shire, because he's never heard of the Shire. It's unimportant. It obviously has to be in one of the important places, right? Yeah. Something as big as that. So, the key thing, of course, though, here is the connection is that the dragon sickness in the Hobbit and the power of the ring are very similar. In other words, it's the power of sin. The thing possessed possesses the possessor. We're possessed by our possessions. That's true of the dragon sickness. It's also true of the power of the ring, right? That the ring, that we possess the ring, we end up being possessed by it. So there's an analogy, but the analogy is between the dragon sickness in The Hobbit and the power of the ring in The Lord of the Rings, not the ring in both works.
That's awesome. I just made a note. I'm going to get you a book. I'm going to gift, unless you've read it, but I think you would actually love this book. I'm totally going off the Lord of the Rings for a second, but given how you read these great pieces of literature, you would love a theological book called From Shadows to Reality. From Shadows to Reality. And it's by Jean Danielou, okay? A Jesuit who was involved with Henri de Lubac and then in the Ressourcement movement of bringing back the church fathers. But From Shadows to Reality is all about that Old Testament typology. It's like the definitive work on typology. And what it does is he just starts at Adam and Eve and goes to Noah and then Abraham and et cetera, all the way through the Old Testament stories that we all know, but shows this incredible foreshadowing of what will happen in the Old Testament and how these stories, true typology, he says, is not just a foreshadowing and it's not just allegory. It's actually something that's left incomplete that must be completed in reality later. So the ark of salvation, Noah's ark, it's left hanging. It's imperfect. It has to be fully completed by the church, as this is the true ark of salvation, right? So it goes through all of these stories, and it's a breathtakingly beautiful book, but it will do for the Old Testament stories very much what you do with literature every single day. Yeah. So I got a note. That's your Christmas present.
Thank you.
All right, Jean Danielou.
Thank you in advance.
Yeah, right. Okay. So that was great. We talked about the ring. We talked about Frodo and Bilbo. We talked about Gollum a little bit. Can we zoom out and look at Middle Earth? Like, does that just represent life? Is it meant to be a whole mythology of pre-England? Like, is it the mythology of England going way back? Was he trying to do that? Because I heard one time England didn't really have its own mythology, and so he was kind of making it up. What do you do with the bigger picture, the macro level of Middle Earth? Yeah,
so certainly it is true that Tolkien said that it's an act of patriotism, act of love for England. He wanted to give his own nation its own myth, because he didn't have a national myth as some other nations do. Yeah, so he certainly achieved it, that's for sure. But I think the deeper thing is, I maybe bring in, so Tolkien was very influenced by Chesterton. And Chesterton's part of Chesterton's deep thesis in The Everlasting Man, which we need to remember, so is that we only know about facts, very, very recent facts. So the oldest texts of Western civilization. Well, let's just take the Iliad, right? It's already talking about Troy, which is several hundred years earlier, and the oldest text we have talk about ancient civilizations. In other words, that the human history is like a jigsaw puzzle with the vast majority of the pieces missing. And the further back in time you go, the more pieces are missing. You only have to go back about 2,500 words, 2,500 years, and they're basically all missing, right? But it's quite clear that the oldest sources we have are talking about old civilizations. So what Tolkien does in Middle Earth is say, okay, well, we've got a whole mystery here. We've been on the Earth. I don't know what the latest scientific theory is of how long that human beings have been walking the Earth, but let's say 300,000 years, right? Well, we only know about 3,000 or about 4,000. So there's 250,000 years of blank space out there, right? So blank historical space, right? Which is at least as mysterious, in fact, more mysterious than outer space, because at least we can look at that, even if we're seeing thousands of years old ago. Anyway, so he says, why can't this empty space that I can stick Middle Earth there? It's just basically our Earth, not anywhere else. It's our Earth, just in times before any recorded history remains. So then, if you want, at that point, who's to know whether there were elves?
Right.
You got all these stories about these strange creatures. Why are all these stories being told about these creatures that never existed? Or dragons? Why all different cultures from the Far East to Europe talk about dragons?
I think dragons were just dinosaurs. But go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's possible. I mean, obviously they weren't around at the same time, but they would have seen dinosaur bones.
I think maybe they did. Maybe they were.
Well,
how do we know when they went extinct?
Well, okay. You're beginning to sound like
I'm a young earther.
Yeah,
I'm not a young earther. I flirt with young.
I know.
Earthing.
You're being flippant and whimsical, and there's nothing wrong with that. But
there's something very attractive about being able to follow a strictly biblical worldview on young Earth. I mean, I'm not there, but I'm attracted. Like I want it to be true.
I would recommend you read. I'd recommend you read the chapter in my book of Benedict XVI that you published. I will. Because there's a chapter about what Ratzinger on the Book of Genesis, which actually reflects St. Augustine on the Book of Genesis. That we are meant to see Scripture, particularly the Old Testament, allegorically. You've been saying that yourself. How can there be? If a day is 24 hours because that's how long it takes the Earth to rotate. Well, before the Earth exists, how can there be a day? So if God brings things out of the void, there's no such thing as 24 hours at that point, right? Because there's not an Earth that's revolving. So clearly these are figurative days,
right? And
certainly a million years to God is like a millisecond, because eternity and time, So it literally, I mean, you can't say of God, he was, or he will be. God's omnipresence is not merely that he's present everywhere, which he is. On a much deeper level, everything is present to God, right? So Adam and Eve, the apocalypse, this conversation is present to God. So really talking about how old the earth is when you're thinking from the perspective of God is somewhat absurd, quite frankly.
Yeah, I hear you. All right, Middle Earth, what's like Upper Earth or Lower Earth? Why is it called Middle Earth?
Well, Midgard and Middle Earth are Anglo-Saxon and Norse understandings of this Earth, because below us is the underworld. We might say in some sense hell. Above us is heaven, the domain of the gods. So this is what happens in the middle, right? So
gotcha.
There is this understanding of, should we say, the supernatural, but this is the place where the supernatural interacts with us, but it's the natural level.
All right. Random question, but you've probably been asked this 1,000 times. What about magic? How do you handle this? And connected with this question is I've never paid attention to this debate, but I hear it all the time about Harry Potter versus Lord of the Rings. What do you do with all that?
Well, I wouldn't trust Harry Potter, and I would trust the Lord of the Rings, quite frankly, because I trust the theology of one of the authors. I don't trust the theology of the other. So Tolkien is very, very careful about how he deals with magic. So magic in a medievalist's mind are alchemists. Mm-hmm. In other words, for the most part, they're serving evil. They're mixing science, the physical sciences, with superstition or even witchcraft the supernatural. And the purpose is twofold: to find the elixir of life, to gain immortality, to defeat death, and the other is to find the Philosopher's Stone, how to turn base metal into gold to become stinking rich, right? And the power that goes with that. So these two very selfish, prideful, homo superbus motives are behind alchemy, and this is magic, right? So that's why Sauron and Saruman invent machines to dominate others, right? So that magic is absolutely condemned by Tolkien. But if you have a character who is supernatural, let's go back to the beginning of the Lord of the Rings, when Frodo says, "I wish Uncle Bilbo had destroyed that miserable creature," speaking of Gollum, when he had the chance. It's a pity that he didn't. And Gandalf says, "Pity? It was pity that stayed his hand." And then Gandalf says, "I'm sure he has some role to play yet." And then Gandalf says, "Bilbo was meant to find the ring and not by its maker. And that might be an encouraging thought." In other words, Bilbo was meant to find the ring not by Sauron,
Who made the ring,
not by its maker, but by God.
His divine providence.
Exactly. There's a providential role in this. So
My
in other
next
words,
question was providence.
yeah. So the point is that some magic is not magic; it's miracle, right? It's a supernatural intervention into the natural world, and that can come from demons as well, right? So you have the angelic and divine, supernatural magic, right? Inverted commas, it isn't magic; it's miracle. You always have demonic, supernatural intervention, but the magic as magic in the Lord of the Rings is the alchemist.
Yes, it's magic made the ring.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly.
And so, but when Gandalf does stuff, right, like he smacks his staff and light comes on him, that could just be basic science, right? I mean, that's
no, he's a secret. If it's servant of the secret fire, he's an angelic divine being. No, Gandalf's magic's from God.
Okay, so that's a miracle. That's the miracle.
A miracle. I mean, if the saints have miracles associated with them, right? It's not the saint themselves.
Yeah,
It's not the saint themselves who's doing it. It's the power of God working through the saint. So Gandalf's power is divine power. It's not magic. It's actually
I love
supernatural.
It. Okay, now I can
miraculous.
read that and see the things he does and see the Holy Spirit working. I mean, that's why you talked earlier, like the fire, the secret fire is the Holy Spirit. So he has these miraculous occurrences, I mean, including his own glorification. I love that. But then the actual magic is on the dark side.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people miss, like, I think I totally missed this or never asked the question, as foolish as it sounds, until I watched Rings of Power, which, I did not understand where the rings came from. Like, I just never knew that. Then I realized, oh, Sauron's the Lord of the Ring. Like, that's, I don't know. I wonder if most people realize it's named after the bad guy.
Yep. Exactly.
not the good guy.
Yep. It's the one ring to rule them all, and in the darkness bind them. That's magic.
Yeah, that's magic.
It's evil.
All right. Samwise Gamgee. I mean, he it seems to me whenever I'm hanging out with these big Tolkien fans, and he's the most beloved character of them all. There's something about his innocence that people just love. What do you have to say about him?
Well, did you know the connection between Samwise Gamgee and Batman?
No.
That's why they love him, because his connection between Samwise Gamgee and Batman. Well, it's true, but not in the sense that we might be thinking it. So, in World War I, every officer above a certain rank had a private soldier, a rank private, as personal servant. Tolkien was an officer of the rank that he had his own personal servant. The personal servant, the name that given to those people during World War I was Batman. So Tolkien had his own Batman, right?
Really?
And Tolkien says that he based the character of Samwise Gamgee on his Batman, on his personal servant. And this man wasn't educated. We don't know his name, never gave us his name, but he wasn't educated. It was, but had Tolkien recognizing him, greater nobility, greater courage, greater wisdom than he possessed himself. So that's what goes into Samwise Gamgee. It's the exaltation of the humble.
Amazing. He was like a squire.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Okay, so it's really based on a real person.
Yep.
I wonder if he stayed friends with him, or I wonder, who knows? So that's why everyone loves it. It's the exaltation of the humble. And then I was gonna ask you about Providence, just how Providence kind of works through the whole series. You know, by the way, you always say it's one book. It's not a trilogy.
No,
right?
it's not a trilogy.
Right.
It's just that it was so out of the box that no publisher was going to publish this newfangled sort of genre, 1,000+ word epic. So they broke it up into bite-sized chunks. Which once it became a success, people were happy to have the single volume.
Well, just as we kind of wrap up here, I mean, like, what's the last thoughts on Providence? Because I mean, I think that's the biggest overarching topic we could have. The biggest macro level of Catholicity in this masterpiece is, I would assume, I don't want to put words in your mouth, is divine providence at work. Yeah. Everything from how Gollum is going to play a role. You know, Gandalf foresees that. The exaltation of the humble. You know, God is always doing that. I mean, it's through. Talk about typology from the Old Testament. He's always taking the youngest son. I mean, David, King David, shepherd boy becomes king of Israel. Are you kidding me? This is an absurdity. In fact, kind of related to this, I had Kimberly Begg sitting right here not too long ago, and we talked about the life of Joan of Arc. And Joseph, I never really had much of an interest in her, other than the fact that Mark Twain had a huge interest in her. That kind of piqued my interest. But it's when she told me, in not so many words, but she basically said that Joan of Arc is sort of like the patron saint of the absurd. That, boom, that's, now I'm locked in, right? I mean, this farm girl goes to the king of France and says, God wants me to lead your army. And he lets her do it. And then without ever having read a book, without ever having gone to a military academy, she has divine knowledge infused into her to be one of the greatest military strategists of all time.
Yep. And I mean, the thing about this, we've been talking about fiction and literature, is documented. I mean, she didn't live all that long ago. Yeah. I mean, this is, we know this happened. It's not as if, oh, that's a story.
Right.
You know,
this is not a legend.
Just a legend.
This is not a legend. No.
They've got the text of the trial.
Exactly. I mean, actually, Kimberly emphasized that a lot. It's like, this is one of the most documented people ever.
Yeah.
And Joan was illiterate too, so how could she have learned all the strategy that she employed?
That's what I'm saying. Is like, how could she have learned all this? It was just divinely infused.
Yeah.
But it's the exaltation of the humble, and it's the this absurdity. But when you look throughout the entire Old Testament, God's never choosing the firstborn. He's always choosing, because the world chooses the firstborn. He's always choosing the second one. He's always choosing the smallest. He's always choosing the humble. And he exalts them over and over and over again. So
the greatest poem, perhaps, well, I think probably the greatest poem in scriptures, the opening lines, chapter 1 of St. John's Gospel, which is the last gospel traditional mass, but apart from that, probably the Magnificat. I mean, what is Our Lady's Magnificat except the exaltation of the humble, right?
Yes.
It's beautiful.
To lift up the lowly.
Yeah.
Cast down the mighty from their thrones, and shall lift up the lowly. The Lord of the Rings is a beautiful manifestation of that aspect of divine providence, of the exaltation of the humble, right? I mean, and this is what Providence just loves, that Providence loves to do this, you know, and it's just present everywhere from King David, who was shepherd boy, to Joan of Arc, to Frodo, you know? So last words on Providence, and I'll let you kind of close us out.
Okay. In that case, then, the way I'd probably say that is that exaltation of the humble. To love, as we are meant to love, is an act of humility, right? It's to die to ourselves so we can lay our lives down for the beloved. The most difficult form of love, I mean, we can do that to people we love, such as our spouses and our children, and it's perhaps not too difficult, right, to lay down our lives for those that we love. But the most difficult commandment that Christ gave us is to love our enemy. And to be able to lay down your life self-sacrificially in love for your enemy takes a great deal of humility, right? And this is exactly the deepest element of the Lord of the Rings. I'm going to explain this now. Go back to what we said about when Frodo says, I wish Uncle Bilbo had destroyed that miserable creature Gollum when he had the chance. It's pity that he didn't. And Gandalf says, pity? It was pity that stayed his hand. I'm sure that Gollum has some role to play yet in this.
Yet.
Right? And so Bilbo spares him. Bilbo could have killed Gollum and didn't. Later in the story, Frodo has a chance to have Gollum killed at the Forbidden Pool. And he says, now I do see him, I do pity him. And he stays the hands of the archers so that Gollum's not killed. Later on Mount Doom, Sam has the opportunity to kill Gollum and spares him. 3 separate occasions, 3 separate hobbits passed the ultimate test of humility to lay down their lives for their enemy, to love their enemy. If any of them had failed, Gollum would not have been there at the key moment on Mount Doom. So when we first read The Lord of the Rings, right, and we followed Frodo for, at walking pace for the most part, because he's on foot, right, for about 800 pages at this point, 900 pages. And he gets to Mount Doom, and it's the easy part. I'm going to take my ring off here. I'm not going to throw it in case I lose it. He takes his ring off, right? He's got the ring, and all he has to do now is that, just throw it into the fire, right? But instead he refuses, puts it on, right? The quest is defeated. Now, when we first read that, we are annoyed.
Yeah.
We've invested our time and ourselves in Frodo's quest. He gets to the easy part at the end, and he's a miserable loser, right? We feel cheated, we feel betrayed, and we say, Frodo, you are a miserable loser, right? And then we have our first lesson in literary criticism, learning to read literarily. And we think, hang on for a second. It's not Frodo's fault. Frodo had no choice. Tolkien made him put the ring on.
Tolkien, you're a miserable.
Yeah, Tolkien, you're a miserable loser, right? And then you think, well, okay, well, what's going on here, right? And then you realize that Beowulf, going off on too long a tangent here, Beowulf, a large part of the story of Beowulf is a parable against Pelagianism. Pelagianism as a heresy is that we can get to heaven through the triumph of our own will, but doing it ourselves, right? Yes. That's Pelagianism. Beowulf's the mightiest warrior with the mightiest sword. He can't defeat Grendel's mother without a miraculous sword being presented with scenes from scripture, salvation history on the hilt. This is the sword of grace. It doesn't matter how big you are, how physically powerful, how much technology you've got. Without grace, you cannot defeat evil, right? So what happens at the end is that Gollum is the means by which evil is defeated. And you think, Gollum, right? Gollum's the means by which, but it's not Gollum per se. It's the fact that Gollum has been spared, right, on 3 separate occasions, that he's still there. This is Providence, right? The exaltation of the humble, the forgiveness of enemies, playing itself out in the defeat of evil.
And it's not Gollum, it's the fact that he's been spared 3 times. These small acts of kindness and compassion enable the ring to go into Mount Doom.
That's obviously the hand of Providence.
Dang. Man, it's just a masterpiece. It's a masterpiece. Well, you were talking about loving your enemy, and I'll close out with a quote from Chesterton, who always says is, that the reason you have to love both your enemy and your neighbor is because they're usually the same person. So we might not be on a trek to Mount Doom and having to fight orgs and, everything, but we have to just go about our day and deal with our colleagues and our families and our loved ones and our neighbors. And there's a lot that Tolkien has to teach us in his own life and his fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously at first, but consciously in revision or something. Correct. Like that. Joseph, I started this off by saying you're a champion of for Holy Mother Church, and you are. I mean, anyone who just listened to this sees the value of reading these works with your Catholic sensibility and showing us the truth, beauty, and goodness. And so many authors, but this is just one. We could do this with 20 different authors, but the value that you've provided the church is enormous. And I'm positive, without any shadow of a doubt, that Mr. Tolkien himself is sitting up there thinking very highly of him, very grateful that you are continuing to push his great work and explaining it to all the rest of us. So God bless you, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you. God bless you, Conor.
Let's go get a steak.
Sounds great.
All right. Thank you.
Hey, thanks guys for checking out the Conor Gallagher Show. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, or comment, or whatever you got to do to support it. And I appreciate that very much.